Hey guys, before we begin, I want to let you know that later in this video, I'm going to be making a major announcement. So you want to stick around for that. I'll give you a hint, new content. Pretty good, okay? As for today's videos, we're actually going to try something new. I'm going to tell you 3 stories about real people who had something totally unexpected and insane happen to them. Think like stranger than fiction, that type of thing, that not only changed their lives, but also change the lives of millions of other people too. Now, these stories are kind of a slight departure from what is normal on this channel. We know that, so please let us know in the comments what you think about this series. If you enjoy it, we will do more of them. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all of their very expensive, nice knives in their butcher's block with plastic knives. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One late night in the summer of 1974, a 30-year-old man named Fred stood inside of a loud casino in Las Vegas, feeling incredibly nervous. He knew what he was about to do was a horrible idea. In fact, he didn't even know if he had the guts to try it. Fred grabbed a huge wad of cash out of his pocket, and as he looked at it, he thought about the reason he was here. So Fred had actually flown to Las Vegas on a whim after a bad meeting with a group of investors. So Fred had founded this small company 3 years earlier, and he really needed a loan from these investors, but they had said no. Fred had actually already lost over $13 million to this point, and so the investors said, look, like your track record is not good enough, we're not giving you any more money. And this was a huge problem for Fred, because right now, in all of his company accounts, he had a total of $5,000. And at a minimum, he needed to pay his fuel bill for his company, which was $24,000. And that bill was due soon, so he didn't have enough money to cover it. And besides the fuel bill, he also didn't have any money to make payroll. So basically, Fred did not have any more money. And if he didn't find a way to find more money, he would have to file for bankruptcy, shut his business down, and lay off all of his employees. And so Fred really couldn't think of a worse fate here. He totally believed in this company. I mean, this was his baby. He'd invested all of his inheritance into it. But now it was about to collapse, unless he got really, really lucky. All around him in the casino, Fred could see gamblers hunched over slot machines and over poker tables and blackjack tables, and some people looked elated, like they were having the time of their lives. And many other people looked like they were maybe having the worst time of their lives and were on the brink of tears. Fred didn't know if he'd be celebrating or sobbing by the end of this night. All he knew is he was out of options here. He could either do nothing and just kind of accept his fate, that his business was doomed and would have to be shut down, or he could do what he was doing tonight, which was to basically take what little cash he had and put it on a game of chance, basically gamble the money he had in hopes of winning enough money to keep his business going a little bit longer. And so after taking a calming breath, Fred began walking over to a blackjack table because someone had told him that of all the games you could play in a Las Vegas casino, the game with the best odds was blackjack. Fred chose a table with an open seat. He exchanged all his cash for chips while he prayed that he was making the right choice here. And then Fred began to play. For the first few hands, Fred was pretty cautious, only placing small bets. But he won all those small bets, and it kind of emboldened him. And so he began placing larger bets, and he began winning those bets too. And in fact, it got to the point where he was winning so consistently that a crowd of strangers had formed behind the table just to watch Fred. But Fred wasn't even aware of the crowd behind him. He was so focused on every single hand. I mean, for him, this was like his life he was gambling with. And eventually, he got to a place where he had like a mountain of chips in front of him, and he was gambling huge sums of it all at once. And then eventually, when he had this big mountain of chips in front of him, Fred decided this was it. He was going to double down and go all in. And so he puts all these chips out and he waits, and eventually the dealer flips over their cards. And as soon as they did, the crowd around Fred, who he hadn't even noticed to this point, erupted in cheers because Fred had just won. And when the dealer pushed all the chips back over to him and he got to count how much money he had, he realized he had started with $5,000, but now had $27,000. he had gambled and won. $27,000 was just enough to pay that fuel bill and keep his company running a little bit longer. So basically exactly what Fred had hoped for had happened. And then during this extra time that Fred had basically won himself, he was able to secure $11 million in investor funding, which was enough money to finally scale up this small business into the behemoth that we know it as today. Fred went from being a guy betting his last chips at a casino to now being a multi-billionaire. Fred's full name is Fred Smith, and that little company that he scaled up on a gamble was FedEx. I have a major announcement. Ballen Studios, the home of the strange, dark, and mysterious, today has launched another brand new show. It's called Late Nights with Nexpo. It is totally free. It's a podcast, and it's hosted by none other than Nexpo, who you might already know from YouTube, who's been around for many years. He's got millions of subscribers on YouTube. He's got this incredible immersive storytelling style. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, I know you're gonna like Late Nights with Nexpo. And the stories, the mysteries, the kind of bone-chilling, crazy stuff he's gonna cover on this podcast will be exclusive to the podcast. So you can't get these stories on his YouTube channel. You can only get them on this Ballen Studios production. Okay, so it's called Late Nights with Nexpo. It comes out every Wednesday, and at the end of today's YouTube video, we're gonna play you a sneak peek of the first episode. But beyond that, after this YouTube video is over, you can just look up Late Nights with Nexpo on any podcast platform, and you can listen today to the first 2 episodes, because they're live right now. So again, if you are a fan of the content you already get on this YouTube channel, The Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, you're gonna love Late Nights with Nexpo. It's a free show out of Ballen Studios every Wednesday. Enjoy. One evening in the late 1980s, a man in his 20s named Norm walked into a house party in the Hollywood Hills, which is a very exclusive and pricey neighborhood in Los Angeles, California. In this house, which was filled with people, there were all these actors and entertainers and Hollywood-type people, and Norm, who was this kind of scruffy guy with long stringy hair and who had no experience in the entertainment industry, knew he did not fit in here at all. In fact, Norm never would have been at a party like this if not for what had happened to him just a few hours earlier. So that afternoon, Norm had gotten into a fight with his boss at the motorcycle shop where he worked. Now, Norm and his boss never got along, but they managed to coexist for the most part, except today, this small argument had turned into a huge argument that turned into Norm getting fired. And so after getting fired, Norm left the shop and just began aimlessly walking around Los Angeles until he wound up running into one of his friends. And over the course of this conversation where Norm's like, yeah, I got fired, not doing too good, the friend was like, oh, well, tonight there's gonna be this big party up in the Hollywood Hills. Why don't you come along? And Norm, who was feeling admittedly pretty down after being fired, decided, you know what the heck? I'll go to this party because maybe that will boost my spirits. And so now here he was. And so Norm went and found his friend in the house party, and for a little while, the party was pretty great. I mean, Norm felt kind of uncomfortable, didn't really know anybody. It was kind of awkward, but it was fine. Him and his friend were drinking and chatting, and his friend was introducing him to some people, and it was all good. Except Norm just couldn't shake the anger he felt about getting fired. Not only at the fact that he was now unemployed, which was a huge problem, but he also just felt mad at his boss. Like, how dare his boss do this to him? And so to cope with this, Norm just began drinking really heavily, like way more than anybody else at this party. And before long, Norm was completely plastered drunk. But it would turn out, getting totally smashed did not calm Norm down. In fact, if anything, it only made him more blind with rage about what had happened to him. And so naturally what he did is he departs his friend and pushes through the crowd of people, and he goes up to the second floor where there was this balcony that overlooked where basically everybody in the house was. And Norm, who's slurring his speech and he's totally a mess, he screams out to the crowd of these people that he doesn't even know, these Hollywood people, basically screams at them to stop what they're doing and listen to him. And everyone did. They turned around and looked up at this guy like, what's going on here? And Norm just begins delivering this totally angry rant that kind of didn't even make any sense. I mean, he's drunk, but he's basically ranting about how mad he is and this horrible injustice that's been done to him, and just on and on. He's just pouring out all of his emotions, and everybody's just kind of looking at him like, what is going on here? It was like a train wreck, you know? They couldn't look away. Eventually, Norman finished up his big, rambling, humiliating speech, and he stepped away from the railing, and everybody down below who, you know, had been wrapped to this point, but now was kind of like, whatever. They went back to the party, and Norm just stood up there kind of taking in the scene, and suddenly he felt a tap on his shoulder. And he turned around and he saw there was this person he didn't recognize, and this person says to Norm, "Hey, have you ever considered acting in a play?" It would turn out that person was a Hollywood producer, and they were putting on a play in LA. And they really liked Norm's look, the whole kind of scruffy vibe, but even more as they watched him deliver that totally angry, drunken rant that he managed to get all these people to listen to, that it was obvious he had natural charisma and he could command an audience even when the audience had no idea what he was talking about. And so ultimately, this producer literally offered Norm an acting job, and Norm, who really didn't have aspirations to be an actor, but now needed a job because he had just been fired that day, you know, he's unemployed, he agreed. He said, "Okay, I'll act in your play." And so Norman would act in this play, and he would do such a good job, despite the fact that he totally was not an actor. He literally was a drunk guy at a party who randomly got recognized by some producer. But regardless, he acts in this play, and he is such a natural and does such a good job that he gets noticed by other Hollywood producers and casting directors. And before long, he lands his starring role in the mega hit TV show, The Walking Dead. Norm's full name is Norman Reedus. One evening in the late winter of 1973, a 23-year-old mother named Tabby put her 8-month-old son and 2-year-old daughter down for their naps inside of their double-wide trailer, which was parked in a small town in New England. Once her kids fell asleep, Tabby looked over at the clock. She was waiting for her husband to get home from his job as a high school teacher, and he was running late. Tabby wondered, what could be holding up her husband, and she certainly hoped he was okay, but she couldn't just call the high school to ask how he was doing because they didn't own a landline phone. They literally didn't have enough money to afford a landline phone in their trailer. In fact, they basically only had enough money to barely make ends meet. So Tabby and her husband actually had dreams of becoming professional writers, but they had found over the past few years that breaking into writing at this time in America was nearly impossible. They had gotten a few stories published here and there, but for the most part, the only thing their writing had gotten them was a whole bunch of rejection. And so as a result of this, both of them had taken day jobs to basically supplement the income that was not being generated from writing. Tabby was home with the kids, and then in the evening would work some shifts at a Dunkin' Donuts. And then her husband, in addition to being a teacher, also worked at a laundromat. But even with their 3 jobs combined, they barely made any money. Now, Tabby still held on to hope that, maybe one day she could break in and be a professional writer and have that be her primary income. But her husband, who also, had the same dream, was over time becoming increasingly more pessimistic about his opportunity to, one day just be a writer. He sort of felt like this truly was impossible, that they'd struggle forever and he wouldn't become a writer. Tabby walked to the tiny laundry room in the back of their trailer to switch their clothes from the washer to the dryer. So this room, the laundry room, actually doubled as her husband's office. And as soon as she walked back there, she saw his desk was a total mess. All around his typewriter, which sat right in the middle of the table, were all these empty beer cans and food wrappers and rejection letters from various magazines and publications. And the trash can next to the table on the ground was overflowing with crumpled up pieces of paper. Feeling very annoyed by this mess, Tabby reached down to tie up the trash bag to take it outside. But as she went to do that, she happened to glance at one of these crumpled up pieces of paper in the trash, and she skimmed a couple of sentences that were written on it, that were typed on this paper. And as soon as she did, she stopped because there was something really interesting about this writing. Now, she knew her husband had written whatever was on this page, but generally speaking, her husband always shared with her anything he had written, and she would read everything. And there was something about this text that she knew she had not read it before. Like, this was different. Clearly he wrote it, but she had not seen this before. And so she was curious. So she pulled the paper out of the trash can and smoothed it off. and actually began reading what turned out to be this failed manuscript that her husband had thrown away, and she couldn't believe how good it was. And so it dawned on Tabby that clearly her husband had been working on this in secret, which made her wonder, like, one, why are you doing that? Why are you hiding this particular thing from me when you let me read everything else? And two, again, this is so good. Why is it crumpled up and in the trash? Just then, Tabby heard the front door of the trailer open and her husband come inside. And so Tabby just took the page she was reading and walked out of the laundry room, and she held it up to her husband and she was like, "What is this? Why haven't you shown me this?" And to Tabby's surprise, her husband, when he realized what she was holding, just looked totally embarrassed, like he wished she hadn't seen that. And she said to him, "No, like, this is so good. What's going on here?" And her husband would tell her, "Look, like, I started writing this thing, I didn't really know what it was going to become, but I quickly realized that I don't know enough about the subject matter, and, I'm just not talented enough to finish the story, and even if I was, like, this is too weird, it's too out there, no one would publish this." And so ultimately, he had just thrown it away and not told Tabby. And in fact, he went on to tell Tabby that in addition to this being a failed project, he really understood at this point in his career that he was a failed writer. And right now, what he really needed to do was give up writing altogether and just focus on making money for the family, something they desperately needed. Tabby could see her husband was completely serious. And so she just held up this piece of paper and she said, "No, this is the one. This is the one that's going to help you break through. I know it. And you know what? Even if you don't know the subject matter, I do. I can help you with that. And together, we can make this a full-length novel. You got to see it through. It's too good not to." And so, at Tabby's insistence, that's what her husband did. He would spend several months working with Tabby to finish this novel, and by the spring of 1974, it was done. And so, that same spring, they began shopping the manuscript around to different publishers, really having no idea how anybody was going to react. But they were both totally blown away when one of the major publishers they sent this thing to came back and said, "Not only will we absolutely print this book, but we'll also give you a $400,000 advance," which in today's money is $2.5 million. A massive, massive book deal by any standard. And so the young couple was totally thrilled. They took the book deal, the book got published, and with the money they got, they were able to move out of their double-wide trailer, and they were able to purchase a landline telephone. But that was only the beginning. Tabby's decision to pull that crumpled up piece of paper out of the trash can and force her husband to turn it into a novel would prove to be a good one, because her husband would go on to become arguably one of the most famous writers in the world. That story, the Tabby saved from the trash can, would go on to become the iconic horror novel Carrie. Tabby's husband was none other than Stephen King. And now, from Ballen Studios, here is a clip from our brand new show, Late Nights with Nexpo. You can find this show on any podcast platform, so when you're done listening to this, go find it, give it a follow, and tune in every Wednesday for new episodes. Enjoy.
Siberia, August 1993. The river is freezing cold. Snow melts from the Kamar-Daban mountain range, which looms overhead. Your kayak cuts through the water. You take in the fresh mountain air and the rugged landscape. It's a long overdue escape from the city. Out here, the only signs of civilization are power lines running over the mountains, which are easy enough to ignore. But out of nowhere, something catches your eye, and the peaceful atmosphere dissolves. There's someone standing on the far shore of the river, framed starkly against the trees. It's a teenage girl. She's waving her arms frantically, screaming for you to stop. From this distance, you can't quite make it out, but it looks almost like her jacket is stained with blood. You don't hesitate. You dive into the frigid water and swim to shore. And when you reach the girl, she collapses into your arms. She's delirious, inconsolable. You can barely make out half of what she's saying through her sobs. She says she's scared, that she's all alone. You wonder why this girl's out in the wild by herself. But what she says next answers your question. It makes your blood run as cold as the river. Everyone else is dead.
You can find this show on any podcast platform. Go find it, give it a follow, and tune in every Wednesday for new episodes. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. At a certain point in today's story, you're going to hear what sounds like the end of the story, like the final reveal. Except it's not. There's a whole nother layer to this story if you just stick around, and it is completely insane. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to take the like button on an amazing vacation to this gorgeous private island with this beautiful beach. But as soon as you pilot the boat in and drop them off, you just turn around and drive away and don't come back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1962, a middle-aged woman named Angelina Narcisse walked into a hospital room inside the Hôpital Albert Schweitzer, which is a medical center in central Haiti. Inside, Angelina saw one of her brothers, 40-year-old Clervius, propped up in the hospital bed. He had an IV sticking out of one arm, and he had an oxygen mask strapped over his face. His eyes were closed, and when Angelina touched his hand and said hello, he didn't react. So Angelina had just been briefed by Clervius's doctors about what was going on here. She knew that 2 days earlier, her brother had come to the hospital coughing up blood and also running a dangerously high fever. Doctors had managed to get his fever down, but they determined that his blood pressure was really high and he also had fluid accumulating in his lungs. But they didn't know why any of that was happening or how to control it or stop it. So now, less than 48 hours after Clervius' symptoms began, he was barely conscious. And so for Angelina, it was obviously, very scary to see her brother so sick like this, but it was also confusing because she knew that one of her other brothers had seen Clervius just a few hours before he had shown up at the hospital with these horrible symptoms. And Clervius, at the time, had seemed completely fine. So really, this illness seemed to have come out of nowhere. But as Angelina looked around the hospital room, she also found herself feeling pretty annoyed because she had 4 other siblings, 2 more brothers and 2 sisters, and none of them were here. Now, Angelina knew she shouldn't be surprised. Ever since their parents had died, there had been basically nonstop drama between all the siblings, and most of the drama centered around Clervius himself. So when their parents had passed away, Clervius was the one who had ultimately inherited their money and land. And so these days, he was sort of living like a king. He lived in one of the nicest places in their village and was constantly flaunting his wealth. Meanwhile, Angelina and her other siblings really struggled financially. And anytime they asked Clervius for help, he refused, which had caused a huge rift in the family. So, Angelina was now the only one who'd even shown up to visit him in the hospital, despite his condition being so dire. But, nonetheless, she sat down on a plastic chair inside the room, and for a few minutes, she just watched Clervius breathing. And for a while, his breathing seemed normal. It was rhythmic, slow, but normal. But then suddenly, Clervius's breath seemed to almost catch in his chest. And then he began making a sort of wheezing, gurgling sound, but he's like half conscious. So it was like his body was reacting to not being able to breathe. Angelina instinctively just stood up and grabbed her brother's hand and began to squeeze it. And as she did, she saw her brother's eyelids flutter open for a second, but then his eyelids closed And she watched as underneath his eyelids, she could see his eyes kind of darting around all over the place. And then at the same time, this sort of wheezing sound that was coming out of her brother turned into a choking noise. And so Angelina, at this point, let go of her brother's hand. She ran into the hallway and she found a doctor. But unfortunately, by the time she explained what was going on and she and this doctor returned to the hospital room, they found Clervius no longer making any noise. He was totally still. And so the doctor rushed over to him and he checked for a pulse, but he couldn't find one. And he turned to Angelina and he said, "I'm sorry, but your brother is dead." The following morning, May 3rd, Angelina arrived at the small cemetery near their village for her brother's funeral. And she was glad to see that at least this time her 4 remaining siblings had decided to show up. But at the same time, Angelina, she was in shock. She couldn't believe what had happened. The doctors had told her that ultimately Clervius had died from something called malignant hypertension, which is basically blood pressure that's so high it causes organ damage. And also it causes pulmonary edema, which is fluid in the lungs that can ultimately make it impossible to breathe, which very likely was what that sound was her brother was making before he died, that choking sound. But the doctors told Angelina that despite knowing sort of what actually happened to Clervius, they didn't know why it happened. It was totally unclear how he got these symptoms in the first place. And unfortunately for Angelina and their family, it seemed pretty unlikely that they would ever figure it out. It would just be this mystery. Now, as Angelina walked up to Clervius' gravesite, she looked down and she saw her brother lying dead inside of his open casket. She reached out and touched his hand one last time, and it was so cold that Angelina pulled it away right away, and then she began to cry. The ceremony was kind of a blur for Angelina. The whole thing just felt surreal. But eventually it wrapped up, and Angelina and her other siblings were walking up to the casket to say their final goodbyes to their brother. And then after they did, they stepped back and they watched as cemetery employees closed Clervius' casket and lowered it into the ground. However, after Angelina and her family had all returned to their homes and were, beginning to grieve the loss of their brother, something else began to happen at that cemetery. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Sometimes I think about being a kid, riding in the back seat at night, street lights flashing across the window, no responsibilities, no real fear of the future. Well, if I could say something to that little kid version of me, I'd probably say, you're gonna be okay, but don't rush it. Don't wish this away. Because when things get hard, it's easy to start looking backwards. Nostalgia is basically a highlight reel. And then you look at your present and it doesn't stand a chance. Here's the thing though, the life you are living right now, you're going to feel nostalgic for this someday. And so if you spend it longing for something that's already gone, you'll miss it twice. If reaching for the past is getting in the way of living now, therapy may help you figure out what you're actually looking for. And it might also help you to start finding more of that in the present. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly, and switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. That same night, a little after midnight, 2 men sort of conspicuously entered the small cemetery carrying shovels. As they walked, they kind of kept looking around to make sure nobody was watching them, and they went up to Clervius' very fresh grave. And with their shovels, they dug and dug until finally they revealed his casket, and they pulled his casket out of the ground, they pried the nails off the top, they flipped it open, and there was Clervius' body. And they pulled his body out, and they laid it on the ground next to the hole in the ground. Then, as fast as they could, they closed the casket back up, now with Clervius' body again outside of it on the ground nearby, and they reburied the casket. They put all the dirt back, all the grass back, made it look like nobody had touched it. And then after that was done, they walked over to Clervius' body and they tied his wrists and ankles together with rope. Then they wrapped Clervius' body in a large black cloth, and then together they hoisted his body up and placed him on their respective shoulders, and together they carried him out of the cemetery and off into the wilderness on the outskirts of the village. And then when the sun began to rise, they stopped and found a good spot to hide along with Clervius' body in the trees. And then when the sun went back down again, the 2 men were up and on the move again with the body. These men did this for days until finally they reached a massive fenced-in plot of land in northern Haiti. When they got there, it was just starting to get light outside. And so with the light, they could see dozens and dozens of these people moving through this vast field in front of them. And all these people were moving in a sort of jerky, unnatural way. And all of them were holding machetes. But these two men who had lugged Clervius's body here were not afraid. They unlocked the fence and carried Clervius's body right up a pathway through the middle of this field, past all these people. But as they passed by these machete-wielding people, they didn't even seem to notice the men or the body. It was like this was totally normal. Eventually, the men reached the middle of this field where there was this building, and the men went inside. And the interior of this building was basically one large room with a table in the center and a bunch of shelves that lined the walls. And the shelves were all stacked with glass containers that had things in them like dried plants and some taxidermied smaller animals, and also what appeared to be some human bones. And standing in the middle of this room was these two men's boss. He was a very old man, and he had this very expectant look on his face. Without saying a word, the two men placed Clervius's body on the table in the center of this room, and they unwrapped the black cloth around him. Their boss looked very carefully at Clervius's face, and then he smiled, and he handed each of the men a stack of money. 18 years later, in February of 1980, Clervius's sister, Angelina, walked through an outdoor market in her small village in central Haiti. Now, by this point, it had been almost 2 decades since Clervius had died, and Angelina didn't really think about him that much anymore. But on this particular day, as she was shopping, an old man approached her, and he was very thin, his face was very sunken, and he had this long, deep scar on his cheek that went from the side of his mouth to his ear, and his eyes were bloodshot, and they were kind of wide, like he was sort of wild. And in this gravelly voice, he told her that his name was Clervius, and that he was her brother. But when Angelina saw this guy and heard this, she did not think this was her brother. She thought, this man is obviously out of his mind, or he's lying, or both. But this is clearly not my brother Clervius. He's dead. And on top of that, like in addition to all the discrepancies that she's immediately clocking, this man did not remotely look like her brother did. He looked completely different. In particular, there was this big scar on his face that she certainly didn't remember on Clervius's face. So Angelina told this man that, no, you are not my brother and you need to leave me alone. But the man, when he heard this, he sort of freaked out, and he grabbed Angelina's shoulders and started violently shaking her, insisting that no, he really was Clervius. Angelina screamed, and the next thing she knew, she was surrounded by a crowd of very confused but worried onlookers, and then a police officer walked over and grabbed the man and dragged him away. Later that same day, a police officer sat in an interview room at the police station across from this older man who kept insisting he was Clervius. And the story that this man told the officer about how he could be a man who had died 18 years earlier really was absolutely insane. Because this man claimed that 18 years earlier, when he died, he remembered that moment because he heard the doctor literally pronounce him dead, and he heard his siblings start to cry. And then he remembered the cold when the hospital staff moved him to the refrigerated morgue. And then he remembered the sound of them nailing his coffin shut. And he remembered what it felt like when one of those nails punctured through and cut his cheek. That's how he got that big scar on his face. It was a nail in his coffin going through his face. Basically, he wasn't dead. He was totally mentally conscious of everything happening to him. He just physically couldn't move or react in any way, and he didn't know why. But everybody thought he was dead, and he wasn't. And then he said later that same night, as he's literally in a coffin underground, basically waiting to suffocate to death, he became aware of 2 men suddenly unearthing him and removing him from his coffin, and then they tied him up, wrapped him in cloth, and then carried him into the wilderness for days. And then finally, they entered this building in the middle of this field, and they set him down on this table. And then he heard this third man thank the man that had carried him, and then this third man poured something into Clervius's mouth, and then this guy just started chanting over and over again. And then a few minutes later, he found his body sort of was beginning to work again. He could open his eyes, he could sort of move his limbs, but things just felt different. Like suddenly his vision was very strange and hazy, and his body movements were jerky and uncoordinated. It almost felt like his mind was moving slower than it really was supposed to, like it was just dumbed down or something. And it was at that point that Clervius said he realized what was actually going on here. Clervius said this old man that had poured whatever in his mouth and was now chanting, he was a Bokor, which is a voodoo priest in Haiti. And Clervius said the Bokor had used a potion to turn Clervius into a zombie. Clervius told the police officer that he'd been absolutely terrified and he wanted to fight back, but his body felt like jello and he could barely form a coherent thought, so there was no way he could actually do anything. He said the Bokor, shortly after this, untied him, made him stand up, and then marched him outside of this building. And he said everything looked so blurry outside, but he could tell, despite his vision, that he was in the middle of a huge sugarcane field. And he saw at least a dozen other people moving in the same sort of awkward, jerky way that he knew he was, harvesting the sugarcane with machetes. The Bokor at this point handed Clervius a machete and told him to get out there and join them and get to work. Now, something deep in Clervius's mind told him to use the machete to attack the Bokor so he could escape, but he said he didn't. Instead, he just walked out into the field and did start working. And he kept working day in and day out in this bizarre zombie-like state for 2 full years. Then one day, another one of these zombies finally did attack and kill the Bokor. And suddenly all the zombies were free. But the man saying he was Clervius did not go straight home. He couldn't, because he knew this Bokor had not randomly targeted him. He had been hired, the Bokor had been hired to turn Clervius into a zombie. And in the mind of this man who claimed to be Clervius, there was only one person who would have hired this Bokor to do that. And that person was still alive back home in his village. And so if he returned, they would very likely just kill him. So this man told the police officer that he had gone on to spend 16 years just wandering around northern Haiti, working random odd jobs, just kind of barely surviving. But he said he did keep up with news from his village. And when he saw that the person who he believed had ultimately hired the Bokor to do this to him, when he saw that person had died, he said he felt safe enough to finally go back home. Now, after hearing the story, the police officer did not immediately think, boy, this is legitimate, this must have happened. Instead, he thought this sounded completely insane. But just in case, he went to Clervius's siblings and he asked them to give him a list of questions that only the real Clervius could answer, like super specific information from their childhood and things like that. And when the officer came back with this list and began asking this man the questions, the man claiming to be Clervius answered all of them correctly. This really was Clervius. The news of Clervius's return from the dead quickly spread all across the globe. But for the most part, when people outside of Haiti read or heard about it, they assumed the story was just folklore or some kind of hoax. But in 1982, so 20 years after Clervius supposedly died, and 2 years after he supposedly came back to life, a Harvard University researcher named Wade Davis actually traveled to Haiti to investigate the story. And what he found was that Clervius was definitely telling the truth. Here's what many scientists and Clervius's family believe really happened to him on the morning of April 30th, 1962, when he first got really sick. So that morning, he did wake up feeling perfectly fine. He was completely healthy, just like his sister Angelina had thought. But according to Clervius himself, that same afternoon, one of his brothers came over and said he just wanted to put the whole family drama, about the inheritance behind them, and then he gave Clervius a hug. But what Clervius did not know at the time was that during this hug, his brother intentionally rubbed a fine powder onto his skin. Now, this powder did make Clervius incredibly sick, but it was not designed to kill him. Instead, it completely paralyzed him. He couldn't move his arms, his legs, his eyes, nothing, and it lowered his heart rate so low that doctors thought Clervius was dead, which is exactly what Clervius's brother and the Bokor he conspired with had planned for. They knew he would be determined to be dead, he would be buried really quickly, and then right after he was buried, The Beaucours sent those two men to dig Clervius up while he was still paralyzed. They carried him off to that sugarcane plantation where he became a slave. Basically, he was given drugs every day and forced to work nonstop. And for the brother, Clervius' brother, the reason he did this is to punish Clervius for being so selfish with the money he inherited from their parents. This was the plan. Turn him into that zombie slave. It would turn out the active ingredient in the paralyzing powder that the brother rubbed on Clervius was tetrodotoxin, which is a poison found in pufferfish. And then the active ingredient in the liquid that the Beaucours gave Clervius when he arrived and then continued to give him on a near daily basis to keep him in line was called the zombie's cucumber, which is a hallucinogenic plant that's native to Haiti. After returning to his village and telling his story to the world, Clervius actually would go on to live a relatively normal life. He would live with his siblings until he died in 1994 at the age of 72. Even though, he was able to clearly articulate who did this to him, his brother and the Beaucours, both of them were dead by the time he returned and told his story, so nobody was ever held to account for any of this. Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never-before-heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I have something very special to share with you. One of my former teammates from back when I was a Navy SEAL has one of the most insane stories you will ever hear. And recently, he gave me permission to share it. But before we get into his story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please drop a 2,000-pound JDAM on the like button. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In June of 2011, I had just failed a very stressful and anxiety-inducing underwater test as part of Navy SEAL training, and after I failed this test, my instructor told me to get out of the pool and go over to the corner with the other failures. And so I made my way to the edge of the pool, I climbed out, and I sulked my way to the corner where I saw my other classmates who had met a similar fate on this test. They were all sitting in the corner with their backs to the pool in neat rows. And so I was totally gassed from this test. And so when I sat down, I started dramatically breathing really loud and heaving my chest up and down to show off just how hard my test had been. And about 2 seconds into this ridiculous performance of mine, one of my other classmates who had been sitting in the corner when I showed up, a big 18-year-old kid from Wisconsin named Matos, he immediately turned around and made eye contact with me, and through gritted teeth, he just goes, "Shut up! Everybody here is in pain." And then he turned back around. And immediately, I was actually really mad at him because he just totally publicly dimed me out in front of my other classmates. But then it dawned on me, he was right. The job we were trying out for, Navy SEAL, they're not looking for people who just feel bad for themselves all the time. And so I never forgot the lesson Matos taught me on the pool deck that day. And I, along with everybody else in the SEAL teams, never forgot the totally insane thing that Matos did 5 years later that was picked up by virtually every major news network at the time. Back in 2012, so about a year after our exchange on the pool deck, Ephraim and I graduated and became Navy SEALs. I was assigned to an East Coast SEAL team and he was assigned to a West Coast one. And over the next 5 years, I never saw the guy until I saw him on TV. It was mid-June 2017, and I was on base in Virginia in an office full of other Navy SEALs, and we were wrapping up for the day. I was closing my email and powering down my computer, and I noticed my phone that was sitting on the table suddenly started lighting up with all these text messages from current and former teammates. And so I grabbed my phone, and all the messages said the same thing. turn on the news. And so in this office we were in, there was always a TV that was turned to the news sitting in the corner that was on mute. And so I turned to look at this TV, and on the TV from a distance, all I can see is breaking news and Middle East. And so given our profession, news like that tended to have a direct impact on our day-to-day lives. And so I assumed all these text messages must be about whatever happened in the Middle East. And so I get up, I walk over, I grab the remote, and on my walk back to my seat, I'm turning the volume up, and everybody else in the room is turning around to watch the TV as well. And we start hearing the TV reporters talking about this group of American civilians that had gone to Iraq and taken up arms against the terrorist organization ISIS. And so as they're talking about this group of American civilians, they put on the screen an image of one of these Americans. It was this big bearded guy in his mid-20s carrying an AK-47 rifle standing behind a tank somewhere in the Middle East. And as soon as I saw that picture, I knew right away why I had gotten that flurry of text messages from current and former teammates. It's because we all know this guy. The guy on TV was Ephraim Matos. 5 years earlier, after our graduation, Ephraim checked into his first SEAL team out on the West Coast, and very quickly after he showed up, they deployed to Afghanistan. During one of their missions, Ephraim was in the back of his patrol as they walked across this huge open field as they left this village they had just been in. And so Ephraim, in virtue of being in the back of the patrol, was in charge of looking behind the unit and make sure no one was coming after them. And so Ephraim periodically would turn around and he would look and make sure no one was following them. And then at some point when he turned around, he saw two little girls that couldn't have been more than 5 and 7 years old running out of the village and start running down the road towards them. Now, earlier in the day, when Ephraim and his team had been in that village, they had found a children's backpack lying in the middle of the road. And when they went up to inspect it, it turned out to be rigged with explosives. Now, no one had gotten hurt. They had defused the explosives, but they were very weary for children's backpacks. And so as Ephraim sees these two girls running up to him, he can see they're both wearing similar style backpacks to the one they found in the road. They were suicide bombers. Ephraim began screaming at these girls to stop, go back, don't come any closer, or I'll have to shoot at you. But he could tell they weren't stopping. They were just running up the road. He could see there were tears coming down their face. They were totally upset. They were obviously innocent. They were young kids. They'd been put up to this by the Taliban. But Ephraim, because he was in the rear security of his patrol, he had to deal with them like they were threats. And so at some point when they wouldn't stop, he raised his rifle up, he flipped the gun off safe, and he put his reticle right on one of the girls, and he began applying pressure to his trigger. But right as he was about to squeeze and fire a shot, the girls just abruptly stopped. It's like they knew they were about to be shot. And they turned around and they ran back towards the village. And so Ephraim put his finger off the trigger, he flipped it back on safe, he lowered his rifle, and he breathed a huge sigh of relief. But even though he didn't have to engage these poor girls, that experience totally haunted Ephraim. In fact, of all the combat he got in on that deployment, that experience with those innocent girls had the most impact on him. How could anybody force a child to be a suicide bomber? How could anyone be that cruel? And so by the time Ephraim came back to the United States after that deployment, he had changed. That experience specifically had changed him. Even though he believed in the US government's mission over in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, he felt like he could be doing more for these poor innocent people that were just trapped inside of conflict zones like these two little girls. And so over the next few years, he began looking at different conflict zones all over the world where civilians were in the most danger. And he discovered there was one place that was killing and exploiting civilians at an unprecedented rate. And that place was Iraq, where a new terrorist organization had taken power called ISIS. So in early 2017, when Ephraim's Navy contract ran out and it was time for him to decide if he wanted to stay in the SEAL teams or get out and become a civilian, he opted to not re-enlist, so he left the military, and instead he got on social media and he contacted a foreign volunteer group in Iraq that was providing humanitarian aid to civilians. And he reached out to them and he said, "Hey, can I join you?" And of course, they said, yes, we'd love to have a Navy SEAL come out and support us. And so just a couple of days later, Ephraim sold his house, he packed up a bag of clothes and a backpack, he grabbed his passport, and he hopped on a plane and he flew to northern Iraq all by himself. Now, before we continue the rest of the story, you need to understand just how bold this move was by Ephraim. Now, when he was a Navy SEAL, and so a member of the United States military on active duty, when he went to Afghanistan, to a war zone, he had lots of support. If his team got pinned down by the enemy, they could call in an airstrike, or they could call in backup. If Ephraim got hurt on the battlefield, or his teammates got hurt on the battlefield, they could call in special medical teams that would fly in virtually any condition to come save them. And if Ephraim got captured by the enemy, you better believe America is coming for him. But in this case, Ephraim went to a war zone as a civilian. He was not in the US military, so he didn't have any of that support. If he or his team got pinned down out in Iraq, they would either have to fight their way out or get killed or captured. If he or one of his new teammates from this volunteer group got hurt, they would have to either save themselves or get killed or captured. And if Ephraim got captured as a civilian, nobody's coming for him. Nobody even knows he's been captured. He is completely on his own. But Ephraim knew these risks. In fact, he knew them better than most people because he had already deployed to a war zone and saw how important it was to have a support infrastructure. So when he flew to Iraq as a civilian, he knew he was hanging it out there, but he just didn't care. He felt like he had a mission to go help these innocent people because nobody else was. When he arrived in Iraq in March of 2017, he was met at the airport by one of the guys from this volunteer group Ephraim was going out to join. He was a very muscular, tattooed American in his mid-30s who introduced himself as Sky, and he said he had been a Marine, and while he was in the Marines, he had deployed to Iraq, so he was familiar with the area. The pair hopped in a vehicle, and Sky drove them to the volunteer group's safe house in the city, where Ephraim got a chance to meet the leader of this group. It was a tough-as-nails former Army Special Forces guy in his mid-50s named Dave. And Dave, for the past several decades, had been going out to conflict zones all over the world, and he would tell Ephraim that the worst atrocities he had seen committed against civilians in any of these places was where they were right now, in Iraq, at the hands of ISIS. A few days later, Ephraim, Sky, Dave, and a few other American volunteers loaded up into this convoy made up of armored ambulances, and they left the city and they headed west into the countryside towards a huge city called Mosul that 3 years earlier had been captured by ISIS. On their journey towards the city, Ephraim and the others had to pass through a number of military checkpoints. Now, most of these checkpoints were stood up by their ally, the Iraqi army. But Ephraim and the others knew that they might stumble upon an ISIS checkpoint, and in virtue of all of them being pale-skinned Americans, they would instantly be recognized as the enemy and fired upon. So every time they slowed down for one of these checkpoints, Ephraim and the others would clutch their guns closely and mentally prepare themselves for a potential vicious close-quarters fight to the death. But luckily, they managed to go the entire distance all the way to the outskirts of Mosul without any checkpoint drama. And once they got there, they linked up with an Iraqi army unit that the leader of this volunteer group, Dave, had a relationship with. Over the first month that Ephraim was in country, he worked with this Iraqi army unit to help distribute food and provide medical care to civilians in and around Mosul. Then, in month 2 of his stay in Iraq, everything changed. Iraqi decision makers decided it was finally time to retake Mosul from ISIS. This was a huge military movement that required several units to work together and would take several weeks. The main Iraqi army was going to push inside of the city limits of Mosul and inch by inch reclaim territory from ISIS, while the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with would be responsible for reclaiming some of the villages around Mosul that ISIS had occupied. And so suddenly, Ephraim and the rest of his volunteer group went from being humanitarian aid workers to having a direct frontline combat role with the Iraqi army. And in his first civilian combat experience, Ephraim ran across an active minefield towards this village that was occupied by ISIS. And after nearly being blown up at least 2 times, Ephraim finally made it to this village, and he began going house to house with the other volunteers, clearing them of ISIS fighters. And in one instance that he has on camera, he entered into this structure and he saw there were guns on the ground, and they looked around and they couldn't find any ISIS fighters inside, but they noticed on the ground there was a piece of plywood. They moved it aside and it revealed this huge hole that led down into the ground, and this hole connected to a huge underground tunnel system that ISIS used to escape gunfights just like this one. And so Ephraim and Dave, who was with him, just hopped right down into the tunnel. They didn't have night vision, they didn't have backup, just the two of them start running down this totally pitch black tunnel tunnel, periodically throwing grenades ahead of them in case there are ISIS fighters ahead of them. And at some point, after running for quite a while, just getting ready to come in contact with their adversaries, they reach this big, high-ceilinged cavern that's a dead end. And they're looking around thinking, okay, I guess no one ran in here. But before they turned around and left the tunnel system, they looked up with their lights and they saw high up on the wall, dug into the wall, was another entrance to another tunnel. It looked like there needed to be a ladder to get up to this additional tunnel entrance. And so Ephraim and Dave look at each other and they're thinking, I bet ISIS fighters ran down here, there was a ladder, they climbed up and went in that entrance and then pulled the ladder up so we can't follow them. And so Ephraim and Dave couldn't do anything about it. They decide, okay, well, we'll just go out and we'll tell the Iraqi army and see what they want to do. So Ephraim and Dave, they leave this tunnel system, they go back outside, they tell the Iraqi army, and the Iraqi army brings in a bulldozer and they fill in that entrance they had found inside of the house, completely seal it up so nobody could go in or get out. And then later that night, after that village had been cleared of all ISIS fighters, they began hearing muffled explosions underground near where this entrance to this tunnel was. And what it turned out to be was ISIS fighters that realized they had been buried alive. They had snuck down there. They had used a ladder to get up into that crawl space. But when they realized they were doomed, they blew themselves up. For the next month, Ephraim and the Iraqi army unit that he and his volunteers were working with continued to periodically get into small skirmishes with ISIS in these villages outside of Mosul, but the majority of their time was spent providing humanitarian aid and medical care to civilians in the area. Then in May, their mission changed again. The other Iraqi army units that had been sent directly into Mosul a month earlier to inch by inch eradicate the area of ISIS fighters, they had done a relatively good job, but the last few ISIS fighters had been pushed up into this northern section of the city where they had bunkered down inside of these blown out concrete structures, and they were putting up an unbelievably fierce fight. So fierce, in fact, that these Iraqi army units in the city were not able to go any farther forward. They needed armored vehicles and tanks if they were going to be successful. And it just so happened the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with, that had been outside of Mosul this whole time, they were an armored unit. They had armored vehicles and tanks. And they were ordered to head right into the heart of Mosul and liberate it once and for all. And so on May 4th, Ephraim and the other volunteers loaded up in their armored vehicles and they joined this huge line of dozens and dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles looking at the western side of Mosul. There was just a field between them and the city walls. And as soon as this massive convoy began moving forward towards the city just opened up on them. Heavy machine gun fire, rocket fire, mortars. It was just absolute chaos. ISIS knew they were coming, and so they were unleashing everything they had on them. And Ephraim would say, after his vehicle actually got inside of the city limits of Mosul and was on one of their roads, all these booby-trapped cars began detonating all around them, and the machine gun fire and rocket fire and mortar fire only intensified. At the same time this was happening, Iraqi civilians inside of Mosul saw this unbelievable wave of violence happening, and they began trying to flee the city. Now, ISIS had effectively kept them hostage inside of Mosul because they needed lots of civilians in and around the area because it prevented Iraq and America and other forces that were fighting ISIS from indiscriminately bombing Mosul to get rid of the ISIS presence there. And so when ISIS saw these civilians running away, they began shooting them to deter other civilians from trying to escape. And so right in front of Ephraim, as he's driving into the city, men, women, children are just being gunned down all over the place. Naturally, Ephraim and the other volunteers hopped out and tried to return fire at these ISIS shooters, but they were so well fortified in different structures, they couldn't even see them, let alone hit them. So they did the next best thing. Ephraim and the others began putting themselves out in the open to draw fire on themselves so that other nearby civilians could run to safety. And for the next 3 days, that's what they did, constantly exposing themselves and dodging bullets. And then also, when they weren't doing that, they were treating these civilians that had been wounded and other Iraqi soldiers that had been wounded. Now, to this point, Ephraim had seen combat when he was in the United States Navy as a Navy SEAL, and he'd seen combat as a volunteer with this group. But it wasn't until he got inside of Mosul that he saw just how barbaric humans can be to one another. He said he saw so much death and dying all around him that it was like his brain couldn't compute that level of barbarism. He would later write a book called The City of Death, and it was about his experience in Mosul. And he said the reason he named the book The City of Death is because that's what it felt like. Everywhere around him was just death. For the next several weeks, Ephraim and the other volunteers took up a position in the south section of Mosul inside of this bombed out building. They created a sort of aid station, and there they focused all of their attention on trying to treat as many wounded civilians and wounded Iraqi soldiers as they possibly could. At the same time, the rest of the Iraqi army had pushed north and was slowly chipping away at the last few ISIS fighters. On June 1st, so roughly 1 month after Ephraim and the others have entered into the city of Mosul, they noticed a significant uptick in the number of wounded civilians that were coming to them for help. And so all day and all night, they're treating all these people that are horribly wounded with gunshot wounds and other wounds. And so at some point, Ephraim and the others begin asking these people, what happened to you? This seems unusual that so many people would show up with these wounds. And they all just seemed to be in shock. No one was able to really talk about what happened, but a few people mentioned there had been a massacre somewhere nearby. But when they pried for more information, there was a language barrier issue, and there was just the fact that they were overwhelmed with patients, and they needed to make sure their focus was on treating them, not talking to them. The following morning, though, Ephraim and the others got up and decided they wanted to push farther north into ISIS-held territory to see if there was evidence of a massacre, to try to figure out what happened to all these people that were showing up wounded. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers, they left their aid station building and they moved north about 1 block to this huge intersection, and there they tucked up against this huge concrete wall that protected them from ISIS. ISIS was down the other road that ran through the intersection. They were holed up in this huge bombed out hospital that overlooked this intersection. And so from where they were, ISIS couldn't see them and they couldn't shoot them. At some point, Ephraim poked his head around this wall, looking down the road towards this burned out hospital, and what he saw along the road shocked him. There were dozens and dozens of civilians that had been killed laying all over the place. It would turn out the day before, a huge group of civilians had attempted to flee the city, and they ran in front of that burned out hospital where ISIS was, and they gunned them down. And they killed over 200 civilians, men, women, children. They didn't care, and they wounded at least 100 others. And so that was why there was that huge uptick in wounded civilians the day before. And so as Ephraim is scanning this carnage, being careful not to stay exposed for too long, he notices one particularly large pile of bodies. There's about 20 or 30 bodies. He sees in this pile, there's clearly movement. And he can see there is a little girl who's attempting to hide herself under her dead mother's clothing. And then next to this girl were 2 other adult men that clearly were wounded, but were alive. Ephraim immediately starts yelling to them to run to him, you're gonna get killed out there. But the 3 of them were completely shell-shocked. For the past 24 hours, they had been laying inside of this pile of bodies. And so they were not going to be able to move on their own. And so Ephraim realized unless they did something to get them out of there, they were going to die. So Ephraim and the others ran back to their Iraqi army counterparts, and they got them to sign off on a rescue mission. And their plan was they would have one of the Iraqi tanks drive down that road straight towards that hospital where all the ISIS fighters were, and right behind the tank would be an Iraqi Humvee, inside of which would be Ephraim and the other volunteers. And so they would go straight down the road, the tank would serve as a sort of shield for the Humvee, and after the tank passed the pile of dead bodies, the Humvee would be lined up right next to it. Ephraim and the others would hop out, they'd grab the girl and the 2 other men, pull them back in the Humvees, and then the 2 vehicles would back up to safety. Once this plan was in place, Ephraim and Dave and the other volunteers contacted the American military in the area, and they got them to authorize a smoke screen. They would fire artillery shells with airburst smoke grenades that would obscure the view of the ISIS fighters in the hospital. They wouldn't actually be able to see the tank or the Humvee or this rescue operation taking place right in front of them. And so shortly after these plans are totally finalized and Ephraim and the others are loading up in the Humvee and they're getting in position to turn that corner and begin this operation, the driver of the Humvee says, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. It's not safe. I'm not willing to do it. Ephraim and the other volunteers tried to convince him to still do the operation because they didn't have time to get a replacement Humvee, and they had already coordinated with the American artillery units that were going to be firing these shells at a certain time, and so they really didn't have an opportunity to do this operation again if this guy backed out. Not to mention, if they didn't get out there quickly, these 3 people were going to die anyways. And so finally, when Ephraim realized this driver was not going to budge, he was not going to go in this operation, Ephraim and the others got out of the Humvee and they walked up to the tank driver and they asked him, are you still prepared to go on this rescue operation? And he said he was. And so even though if they went through with this mission, it would mean Ephraim and the others would be on foot behind the tank, completely exposed, they were still totally down for doing it. In fact, Ephraim would say at no point did they consider canceling the mission. They were so focused on saving these 3 people that they were prepared to sacrifice themselves to do it. And so the tank driver closed his hatch. Ephraim and the others got behind the tank. They turned that corner so they're facing the hospital. And then a couple minutes later, as planned, American artillery launched these airburst smoke grenades that totally obscured ISIS's view. And as soon as those smoke clouds were in the air, ISIS came out and just started firing randomly straight down in the general direction of where this tank was. They couldn't really see the tank. They had no way of knowing what they were doing out there. They just knew something was going on. And so meanwhile, Ephraim and the others are tucked up behind this tank as it's slow rolling in, as rounds are impacting all around them, mortars start landing all around them, and it turns out there were other ISIS fighters, not just directly ahead of them in the hospital, but also off to their side in other buildings. So they were getting hit from 2 directions. Ephraim remembers as he was behind this tank trying to stay as small as he could, he began dry heaving because he was so terrified. He was completely convinced he was going to die that day. Eventually, the tank made its way just past this pile of bodies, and at that point, Ephraim actually stepped out and fired back towards ISIS in the hospital and over towards the berm to provide some cover fire, while Dave and another volunteer ran over and pulled the girl and the other 2 men out of the pile and behind the tank. The girl and one of the men were okay. They were not badly physically hurt, but the other man was badly hurt and he couldn't walk. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim and his team found a piece of sheet metal on the ground behind this tank, and they rolled him onto it and used it like a stretcher and began dragging him as the tank began moving in reverse. And so as bullets are still flying all around them, rockets are landing next to them, they're moving, they're making good progress, when the wounded man slips off of the sled and he lands right in the tracks of where this tank is going to go. And for a variety of reasons, Ephraim and the others had no way of communicating with the tank driver. So the tank driver is just going to keep on moving and he's going to run over this injured man who can't go anywhere. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim leaps down, he grabs the injured guy, and he rolls with him out of the way of the tracks right as it goes past him. But now Ephraim and this wounded man are outside the protection of the tank, and rounds start impacting all around them. The smoke screen at this point is pretty much cleared, and so ISIS sees them. And Ephraim at this point makes a heartbreaking decision. He looks at this guy who he knows cannot move himself. He's badly wounded. He makes eye contact with him. He holds his hand, and Ephraim just shakes his head and says, "I'm sorry," because he knew he couldn't move him fast enough behind the tank before both of them got shot, and he couldn't throw him on his back in time before both of them got shot. And so he had to leave him. And so Ephraim jumped up, he leapt behind the tank right as a volley of fire hit right where he had been standing, and then Ephraim and the others continued moving back. That wounded man would go on to be killed by ISIS. Only a few moments after Ephraim was back behind the relative safety of the tank, he suddenly fell to the ground and felt a pain in his right leg. He had been shot through the leg. But where he fell was right in line with where one of these tank treads were coming. But again, they can't talk to this tank, so they can't stop the tank from running him over. And so a surge of adrenaline came over Ephraim, and he leapt up onto his feet and just continued hobbling behind the tank despite this gaping hole in his leg. Eventually, they made it all the way back to that intersection where they had started, but the only way they could get back down the alleyway to safety with the Iraqi army was to run across a small segment of this street. Basically, you needed to be exposed for just a second running across. But at this point, the smoke screen was gone. ISIS knew exactly where they were, and they were waiting for them to pop out from behind that tank. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers are screaming across this gap in the road towards the Iraqi army to get them to send an armored vehicle across this road, pick us up, and bring us back across. We can't run across this gap without getting shot. But because of the chaos and the noise, the tank is firing, there's mortars, there's rockets, there's gunfire, it's crazy, the message was just not received. And so in a sudden fit of madness and frustration and fear and all sorts of things, Ephraim just runs across the street. And he gets to the other side miraculously without being hit again. And there he tells the Iraqi army, send an armored Humvee across this gap, get the girl, get the guy, get the rest of the volunteers, save them. Seconds later, an armored Humvee crossed that gap. They picked them up and brought them back. And at this point, Ephraim is now lying on the ground behind that concrete wall. So he's relatively safe and he's getting his leg bandaged up. And he remembers when the girl and the guy were brought out and they were safe and alive, the Iraqi army erupted in cheers. It was this unbelievably happy moment in an absolutely tragic, horrible time. The Iraqis would transport Ephraim in an armored ambulance to an aid station south of where this intersection was, and there they would put him on a cot, and a doctor would rebandage his leg, and then he would walk away. And so Ephraim is left inside of this room to kind of think about what had just happened, and he looked over to his left, and just 2 beds over from him was the girl he had just nearly died saving. And she was sitting on her cot. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking straight ahead. Her dark hair was matted down, and she was just kind of staring into nothingness. It was clear she was still in shock, but she did look relatively unhurt. And then at some point, another Iraqi doctor came over and gave her some food and water, and she ate and drank ferociously. Ephraim just stared at her in awe. At that moment, she was the most important thing in his life. And as he's staring at this miracle child, the doctor that had given her food and water noticed him staring, and he came over to Ephraim and he just said, "Her name is Demoa. She's 4 years old and she's going to be just fine." After the doctor had walked away, Ephraim pulled his hat down over his face and he just wept. Ephraim never had a chance to actually speak to Demoa because she was so scared of everyone around her that he decided to just give her her space. But he would later find out that she was reunited with her living family members, and today she is alive and well. After his injury, Ephraim was sent back to the United States, and it was then that he learned their rescue operation had been filmed by a guy who was there that day documenting war crimes by ISIS. He saw this rescue operation happening, and he just started filming it. After this man posted the footage online, it went viral, and before long, major news outlets all over the world were reaching out to Ephraim and the other volunteers for interviews. This was the story that me and my teammates in Virginia in that office saw in 2017, and that image we saw of Ephraim standing behind the tank with the AK-47, that was moments before he rushed out behind the tank and provided cover fire for Dave and the other to run over and grab the girl and the other 2 men. The gunshot wound that Ephraim sustained in his leg wound up being relatively minor, if you consider gunshot wounds to be minor. It did not hit an artery and it did not shatter his bone. And so after only a few months, he was more or less back to strength, and instead of just taking it easy, he was in another conflict zone in Burma, this time working with a new volunteer organization, one that he founded called Stronghold Rescue and Relief. And their mission is to protect and care for families in conflict zones. Their motto is, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Despite being a very small organization, they are having enormous impacts all over the world, but they need our help. They rely on a small army of people who pitch in small donations every month to keep operations flowing. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, please consider joining their army by supporting them on a monthly basis, just like I am. If you do, you'll not only gain my respect and admiration, you'll also get sent one of these awesome shirts with that amazing quote on the back. The link to join their army is in the description of this video. Also, if you just click on that link, it will bring you to their website and you can see the full unedited footage of their rescue mission. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please drop a 2,000-pound JDAM on the like button. Also, go support Stronghold Rescue and Relief by clicking the link in the video description. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In late July of 1988, 2 hunters were walking up the steep mountain trail in Colorado looking for a place to set up for the day. And as they were walking, they eventually left the trail and began kind of meandering through the trees looking for a clearing. And at some point, they spotted a clearing up ahead, but in this clearing, there was this really bright white thing at the base of one of the trees. And so the 2 hunters, they walked up to investigate what this white thing was, and when they saw it, they both knew immediately that this was something no one was supposed to see. And so after the hunters took a mental note of where they were on the mountain, they turned around and rushed back down to town to tell authorities. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is at work, secretly sneak into their house and train their new puppy to bark at shadows and pee behind the washing machine. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 15th, 1988, a man named Keith Reinard drove down the main street of a tiny town called Silver Plume, which is located in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. In his car was everything Keith would need to live for the next 3 months. Silver Plume was the kind of place that most people would just pass by on the highway without even considering stopping. It was kind of a no-name town in the middle of nowhere. In the 1800s, it had been a booming mining town. However, now all but 140 of its residents had either died or moved away. In fact, Silver Plume was considered a living ghost town because of how close it was to being totally abandoned. But this emptiness and kind of middle of nowhere-ness was exactly what appealed to Keith about this town. Keith was 49 years old and lived over 1,000 miles away to the east in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. And Keith had a great life. He was married with 2 kids, a boy and a girl. He had a good job working for a newspaper covering high school sports, and he had a beautiful house. But for Keith, he felt like as good as his life looked on paper, it was missing something. There was one thing he had always wanted to do, but had always put off doing, and that was to write a book. And not just any book, a book that lots of people were going to read, a great American classic. That's what he wanted to make. But there was just one problem. Keith had no idea what this big book was going to be about. And that was why he had come to Silver Plume. Keith had taken a 3-month leave from his job and left his wife and his kids and the city all behind to come out to this town to hopefully, in this new, peaceful, quiet environment, find the inspiration he really needed to not only discover what this book would be about, but to sit down and actually write it. Keith's wife had not been happy about this plan, him kind of being gone for 3 months, not providing any income, not helping with the kids. But she could tell Keith really felt like he needed to do this, and so she gave him her blessing. After arriving on Main Street in Silver Plume, Keith looked up and he saw KP Cafe off to the right. It was a weathered old building that looked like it was straight out of a cowboy movie, and this cafe was exactly the landmark that Keith had been looking for. And so he pulled his car over on the side of the road, he got out, he stretched, and then he began walking towards this cafe. This cafe was the big hangout spot in Silver Plume for all of its 140 residents, and the reason Keith knew this was because his best friend from high school, Ted Parker, owned KP Cafe. Ted had actually been the person who inspired Keith to come to Silver Plume in the first place. He had told him about how peaceful and serene this place was, the best environment for a writer. And when Keith had told Ted that sounds great, I'm going to do it, I'm going to come to Silver Plume, Ted had told him that he also owned the store right next to KP Cafe that used to be a bookstore, but the previous tenant who ran the bookstore had talked about some big European vacation he was going on and then had just kind of vanished. And so for months now, this storefront had been vacant. And so Ted had told Keith that while he was in town, he was more than welcome to work and write out of this vacant bookshop. And so Keith, after walking up to the front window of KP Cafe, he looked inside and didn't see Ted, and so he decided he would take a moment and walk over to this vacant bookshop that would be his office. So he went next door, he pulled out the key that Ted had already sent him in advance, he unlocked the door, and he went inside. And right away, Keith was struck at what he saw. I mean, the place was full of books. Some piles of books were higher than his head, and many of the books looked rare and expensive. And Keith's first thought was, why did this guy who used to run this store just abandon all of this? This had to cost a lot of money. But Keith was far too excited about the next few months and getting this book done that he didn't really think too hard about whatever the previous owner had done. And instead, he just began to daydream about what the next few months would be like and how this book was going to turn out. And as Keith was thinking about his big book project, Ted actually came into the bookstore, and when the two friends saw each other, they ran up to each other and embraced, and then before long, the two of them had gone outside and began walking around Silverplume, just chatting and catching up. And eventually, after chatting and walking around for a really long time, the pair left Silverplume and wound up walking onto this hiking trail that went up into the woods. Now, years earlier, Ted and Keith had both been avid hikers and outdoorsmen, but now, Keith had put on some weight and he really wasn't a big hiker anymore, but Ted didn't really know that. And so Ted, he's leading this hike up this trail as they're still kind of chatting and making light of things. But Keith, as he was struggling to keep up, was getting more and more anxious about this hike. And he also had a deep fear of heights. And this trail appeared to go really high up this mountain. But Keith kept telling himself that, he was here in Silverplume as much to write this book as he was to kind of have a little more adventure in his life. And so he just kept on trudging along after Ted. But eventually, Keith just could not handle how high up they were getting. He was totally terrified of being able to see the valley way down below. And so he had a sort of panic attack where he lunged and grabbed a nearby tree and hugged it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling off the mountain. And when Ted turned around and saw Keith, he rushed over to him and said, "Don't worry, everything is okay." He convinced him to let go of the tree, and then very carefully, Keith and Ted walked back down the trail back into town. And when they got down there, Ted would tell Keith he was so sorry for putting Keith in such a stressful position, and Keith kind of brushed it off and said, it's totally fine, no big deal. Even though this panic attack was very embarrassing for Keith, he wound up just kind of shifting his mental focus to getting settled into this new life he was going to be living for the next few months. And so along with this office space in this old abandoned bookstore that Keith would be using, he also rented a small apartment in the little church in town. And very quickly, Keith developed a sort of daily routine. He would get up early in his apartment and he would make his way over to the bookstore and he would sit down at his computer and he would write all day. But even though Keith was doing a lot of writing, it was not productive writing. It was mostly Keith sitting down, trying to come up with the topic for his book, not being able to do it, and then he just sort of drifted off and began doing journal entries and writing snippets of poetry, and then before long the day was over and he had accomplished nothing. And so at the end of June, roughly 2 weeks after Keith had arrived in town, he was sitting at his computer one morning inside of the bookshop, unable to write anything productive, and he told himself, you know what, I gotta do something to break out of this writer's block. Writer's block is when writers kind of hit a psychological wall and just can't seem to be creative. They can't write. And so Keith decided, in order to kind of get out of this funk, that he would go back up into the mountains again. He would face his fear of heights, and he would get to the summit, and that clean mountain air and all the nature around him would kind of bring him back to reality and give him the inspiration he would need to just write this book. And so Keith turned off his computer, he left the bookstore, he went back to his apartment in the church, he packed some sandwiches and some water into a backpack, and then he walked from the church apartment to the nearby trail that would lead out of Silverplume and up into the forest and into the mountains. It was a hot day that day, but as soon as Keith was underneath the shade of all the trees, it was very cool, and the sounds of the birds and the insects and other animals all around him was very calming. But very quickly, Keith's hike went from very peaceful and relatively flat to very intimidating and very steep. But Keith, he was determined to do this hike. He felt like it was a critical step in the creation of this book. And so he just kept on going one foot after another, huffing and panting and making his way up this incredibly steep trail. And it was like with every step he took, he felt braver and braver. And suddenly he was able to look down at the valley below and not feel as frightened. And then at some point, as he was walking up, he saw all these scratch marks on a tree that were obviously from a mountain lion. But instead of Keith feeling scared, he felt more brave. He felt excited. He felt like this is what he came here for. This book and adventure kind of coming together in this moment. Finally, Keith made it to the top of this trail, and he found this incredible clearing that looked down over the town below, and in this clearing was a monument to a man named Clifford Griffin, who had died at this exact spot 100 years earlier. Keith knew Clifford's story. Back in 1887, when Silver Plume was a booming mining town, Clifford, who was a mine owner, came up to this exact spot in the mountains to play his violin. And then after playing it for a bit, he stopped and dug a grave, stood on the edge of it, shot himself, and fell into the hole. No one knew why he did that, but within a couple of years, the mining industry came to a halt in Silver Plume, and everybody just kind of vanished. And very quickly, rumors began to swirl around the people who remained in Silver Plume, how, their town must be cursed, and maybe it was connected to what happened to poor old Clifford. After staring at this monument for a few minutes, Keith turned his attention to lunch. He pulled off his backpack, took out a sandwich, and he began eating. And as he ate, he looked back at this monument and he thought of another strange Silver Plume story, except this one hit much closer to home. It was about the man who used to run the bookstore where Keith now did all of his writing out of. This man's name was Tom Young, and it would turn out what Keith had heard about Tom when Keith first arrived in Silver Plume was not entirely correct. Keith had been told that Tom had been talking about this European vacation, and so the consensus was that, he had left town and gone to Europe and just not come back. But the reality was, once Keith began asking around a little bit over those first couple of weeks he was there, was that Tom actually had been talking about this big European vacation, but then had walked into the woods, up into the mountains, where Keith was right now, where this monument was, and Tom had just vanished, apparently, in these mountains. Tom apparently had been a very quirky guy who had come to Silver Plume in the 1970s to kind of start a new life for himself. He had been teaching high school students in Denver, but he apparently didn't really like doing that and wanted to start over, and so that was what drew him to Silver Plume. And in Silver Plume, residents always saw Tom, along with his best friend, Gus, his black Labrador retriever, walking around town playing fetch, but instead of using a ball, Tom would throw a chewed-up doll's head. And then, on September 7th, 1987, so roughly 9 months before Keith arrived in Silver Plume, Tom and his dog Gus had gone for a hike in the woods where Keith was, and then vanished. Now, at first, people assumed that because Tom had been talking a lot about going on this European vacation right before he vanished, that must be where he went. But when people checked his shop, they saw all of his books were still in there. It did not appear like he had packed things up. And when the sheriff looked into it, he couldn't find any evidence that Tom had ever bought any plane tickets to go to Europe. And so no one really knew what happened to Tom. It was like this big mystery. And so as Keith was standing in this clearing near this monument, thinking about Tom and his story, Keith began to realize there were a lot of similarities between him, Keith, and Tom. They both, as adults, had come to Silver Plume, this kind of random place in the middle of Colorado, to get a sort of second chance in life. And they both worked out of the exact same storefront. And Keith had done some additional digging on Tom when he heard about this mystery and learned that they were almost the exact same age. Their birthdays were separated by 1 day. Also, Keith discovered that he and Tom had served in the military at almost the exact same time in the 1960s. And so as Keith was going over all these strange coincidences and weird similarities between his life and Tom's, suddenly Keith stopped chewing his sandwich and just quickly packed everything back up. He turned and began running down the trail, going back towards town. And as he ran, Keith smiled because he realized he had just discovered what his great American classic novel was going to be about. It was going to be about Tom. For the entire month of July, all Keith did was write. He was in his office 7 days a week typing away, and then at night when he went back to his apartment, his neighbors would see the lights on all night long. At the end of July, so by this point Keith has been living in Silver Plume for about a month and a half, 2 hunters from Silver Plume began hiking up that same mountain trail that led up into the mountains and into the forest that Keith had gone on recently and found his inspiration for his novel. And so these two hunters, they're making their way up the trail, and at some point they leave the marked trail and begin kind of meandering through the trees. And as they're walking, they're kind of looking for a clearing to set up for the day. And at one point, one of the hunters happens to look up and he sees there's this really bright white thing sitting at the base of a tree in a clearing. And so these two hunters make their way up to this bright white thing, and as soon as they're looking down at it, they realize they have very likely stumbled on a crime scene. At their feet was this green tarp that was partially exposing this white skeleton underneath. And when they pulled back the green tarp a little bit, they saw it was a human skeleton and a dog skeleton kind of lying next to each other as if the two of them had lied down and died there. But what was immediately apparent to these two hunters is that both the human skull and the dog skull had gaping holes in them, like they had been shot. And several feet away from the skeletons was a rusted pistol. And so these two hunters, after staring at the scene in front of them for a couple of seconds, they took a mental note of where they were on the mountain, and then they turned around and headed back down to town to tell the sheriff. And when the sheriff went up with his deputies to go search the scene themselves, they very quickly identified that these remains belonged to Tom Young and his dog Gus. And the sheriff also found out that that pistol that was found several feet away from the two skeletons had been purchased by Tom just a few days before he had vanished. And so the sheriff decided that what must have happened is Tom brought his dog up into the mountains, and after shooting his dog, Tom turned and shot himself. This was a suicide. Case closed. But this explanation didn't make any sense to the people of Silver Plume. First of all, Tom loved his dog Gus. Gus was basically like his child because Tom didn't have any other family, and so why would he hurt his dog? Also, Tom was not acting remotely like someone who was going to commit suicide in the days leading up to his death. People saw him at the grocery store buying a whole bunch of groceries. He talked endlessly about how excited he was about this big European vacation. And then there was this one other thing that also made suicide seem very unlikely. When those two hunters had discovered Tom and Gus, they were partially covered by that green plastic tarp, but it looked very much like the wind and kind of nature in general had blown the tarp off of them, revealing the white bones that the hunters had seen. But what that meant is that very likely that tarp at one point had been totally covering their bodies. And so between that and the fact that the gun was located several feet away from where Tom was, it seemed to the people of Silver Plume that probably somebody else had shot and killed both Tom and Gus, covered them up with this tarp, and then dumped the gun several feet away. Adding to the theory that this was a murder, not a suicide, were the rumors around town that there was this nuclear weapon production facility somewhere near their town, and apparently they were illegally dumping radioactive materials into these old abandoned mine shafts near and in Silver Plume. And people thought, maybe Tom, who had military training, he was actually in the special forces in the military, maybe he had gone out and done some snooping around and discovered this illegal dumping operation, and that got him killed. When Keith heard that Tom and Gus's bodies had been discovered up in the mountains, it was absolutely devastating for Keith. Even though Keith had never actually met Tom, he still felt like he had a bond with Tom. I mean, he was obsessively writing about Tom and learning everything about him, and he also had all these similarities with Tom, and so it was a really big deal to find out that Tom and Gus were dead. But the silver lining to this tragedy was that Keith was now armed with more information about Tom and his dog, and suddenly the ending to his big novel became clear. And so Keith got right back to work. On August 3rd, 1988, so a couple of days after Tom and Gus's skeletons were found up in the mountains, the town of Silver Plume held a memorial service for Tom. And Keith, he would attend this service, and as he listened to the people of Silver Plume talking about Tom and how he had come to Silver Plume to get this second chance at life, Keith couldn't help but feel like it was almost like he was watching his own memorial service, because Tom's life so closely mirrored his own. And then, as he was listening to more and more people talk, Keith started to feel like there was no way Tom killed himself. That can't be what happened. Something else happened to Tom. And Keith was confident that through his research and through doing this book about Tom, he would figure out what happened to him and his dog. As soon as the memorial service ended, Keith quickly slipped out and headed back to his apartment. And when he went inside, he looked around at all the stacks of papers and maps and books that he was using to put together this novel. And he knew that out of all this chaos around him, this novel really was becoming a thing. He was doing it. He was going to get this book done. But he knew there was one more thing he had to do before he could finish this book. And that was, he had to go back up into the mountains. So a few days later, on August 7th, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, Keith walked inside of KP Cafe and strolled up to the counter where his buddy, Ted Parker, was sitting there reading a book. Keith paid for a drink and then announced to Ted that he, Keith, was going to leave this cafe and go right up into the mountains again. And so as Keith told Ted his big plan for this hike he was going to go on, Ted just felt totally confused. Ted's looking at Keith knowing this guy is not a confident climber. I mean, they had gone on that one hike partway up the mountain, and Keith had had a panic attack and had to go back down again. Also, at the top of the mountain, it was like 12,000 feet of elevation where the temperatures would be near or below freezing. And here Keith was just wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had no other equipment with him, no other warm clothes. Also, the route that Keith was describing to Ted would take at least 6 hours round trip. And it's 4:30 p.m. now. And so Ted's thinking, Keith is going to get trapped up in the mountains in the middle of the night. And so Ted finally says to Keith, "I hope you're joking." But Keith would say, "I am not joking. And in fact, I'm leaving right now." And then before Ted could even protest, Keith turned around and while sipping his drink, just casually walked out of the store and began heading towards the mountains. And Ted, he thought about stopping Keith and really talking some sense into him and getting him not to do this hike. But ultimately, Ted decided to do nothing, and he told himself that he would just check on Keith the next day. And so the next morning, Ted, instead of going to his cafe, went first to the bookstore next door to see if Keith was in there. But when he got to the door, it was clear Keith was not inside and the door was locked and everything was dark. And so, trying not to panic, Ted hopped right back into his car and he drove over to the church apartment where Keith had been staying. But again, Keith was not there. And right away, Ted is like, "Oh my goodness, Keith is stuck up on the mountain right now. Exactly what I thought was going to happen has happened." And so right away, Ted rushed to the sheriff to tell him that Keith was missing. And after hearing what Ted had to say, the sheriff would end up launching one of the biggest search and rescue efforts in the history of Colorado. Within 24 hours of being informed of Keith's absence, there were hundreds of people, professional searchers, and just locals who wanted to help, combing this mountain trail looking for Keith. There were planes overhead, there were tracking dogs. I mean, this was a really big deal. And by this point, Keith was very well known in Silver Plume. It's a tiny place. Everybody knows each other, and everyone knew that, he was working on this big book. And so people were really worried about Keith. He was one of theirs. But also, the townspeople were very creeped out by the fact that, Keith, who they knew was very similar to Tom, they knew he was writing about Tom, they knew that Keith was working out of the same storefront that Tom had been in, that now Keith had apparently vanished under the exact same circumstances as Tom. He had wandered into the woods, and that was it. And so it just felt like, how could they have these two people go missing in the exact same way? It just wasn't adding up. On August 9th, so 2 days after Keith had gone missing, and so by this point he's still missing, Ted and some friends decided they would go to Keith's apartment and look around and see if maybe there was some clue as to where Keith went or what he was going to do on this hike. And so they went into his apartment, and Ted's friends began fanning out and looking in the bedroom and looking through all the papers and documents all over the floor, and Ted sat down at Keith's computer. And so Ted fired it up. And as soon as it loaded, there was just this one document on the desktop, and it was the book that Keith was writing. And so Ted clicked on it. And right away, after reading just a couple of lines, he was yelling for his friends to come over here and look at this. And one by one, each of these guys came over and they just could not believe what they were looking at. From the first page of Keith's book, it was clear the setting for his book was Silver Plume, except he renamed it White Plume. He had created all these fictional characters as well that were obviously based on real people, but had renamed them as well. But that was not what shocked Ted and his friends. What shocked them was the main character of this book. His name was Guy Gypsum. Guy Gypsum was a military veteran who had come to White Plume looking for a better life and an opportunity to be closer to nature in rural Colorado. Guy was almost 50 years old, he loved to go hiking, and he worked out of a storefront that was right next to the only cafe in town. Guy Gypsum was both Keith and Tom at the same time. Keith basically had taken Tom's life and Keith's own life and merged them to create this composite character. And when Ted and his friends scrolled to the bottom of this document, they realized that Keith had written an ending for Guy Gypsum's character. These are the final words in this document. Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now, and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forests above. 5 days later, the search for Keith was called off. He was never found. Some people say Keith wandered up into the mountains and accidentally died of exposure, and someday we'll find his remains somewhere in the forest. But others say, after reading that final line in Keith's book, that Keith did all this on purpose. I mean, he literally lived out the final part of his book. He put on his boots and his heavy flannel shirt and his jeans, and he wandered off into the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above and killed himself in order to perhaps get closer to Tom Young, the man he had kind of become obsessed with after learning they were so similar, and the man he kind of like meshed his own life with and created this weird composite character of these two lives. I mean, it seemed like a guy that had kind of spiraled into madness in writing this book and decided that death was the only way to finish the novel. And still others say, maybe there really is some kind of secret illicit operation happening in or around Silver Plume. Maybe it's that radioactive waste getting dumped into the mines that, Tom discovered and that got him killed. And Keith, in researching Tom, also discovered this illegal thing and that got Keith killed as well. But all of those things are just theories because today, officially, there is no answer as to what happened to Keith. His case is still open. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's episode and you want to hear more stories like this one, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have hundreds of stories, many of which are exclusive to the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Around 3 a.m. on September 5th, 1981, a woman drove through a housing development in Lakeland, Florida. With her was her two friends, who had both agreed to spend the night at her duplex. And for this woman, this was a massive relief, because the idea of spending a night alone in her house right now was just terrifying, because the night before, there had been a murder committed right nearby. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and hide open cans of tuna in all their vents, and then turn on the heat at full blast. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just before 8 p.m. on September 3rd, 1981, 31-year-old Linda Slayton stood in her kitchen in Lakeland, Florida, staring into her cupboard. It was almost completely empty, except for a few cans of beans and a bag of flour. And seeing this gave Linda a pit in her stomach, because she knew she would somehow have to turn these sparse ingredients into a meal for her kids. Linda was a single mother of 2 boys, Jeff, who was 15, and Tim, who was 12. And Linda didn't have very much money. And so in order to take care of her kids, she had to be resourceful. Like, finding a way to make food with whatever ingredients she had, and she also would make her kids their own clothing. Anything to save money. Now, up until a few weeks ago, the family had lived in Alabama. But Linda had moved to Lakeland specifically because she had a lot of family and support there. And so Linda had hoped that, because of that support, that, her and her son's lives would, improve quite a bit. It wouldn't feel like such a struggle all the time anymore. But so far, the move to Lakeland had just been more of the same. Linda couldn't find a steady job, so she and the boys had been relying on government assistance and food stamps, which never seemed to be enough to keep these two teenagers well fed. And tonight, Linda's youngest son, Tim, was about to be dropped off after being at football practice, and historically, he was very hungry after practice, and so she really wanted to have dinner ready for him. And on top of that, Linda was hopeful that Tim and her other son, Jeff, would eat fast enough that they would have enough time to make it to a neighbor's housewarming party later that night. So all the neighbors around Linda were basically as new as she was, since the complex they lived in had only been open for about 3 weeks. It was the sprawling development with about 80 one-story duplexes that were technically government-subsidized housing, but it felt more like classic suburbia, since the units were on cul-de-sacs with neat lawns where all the kids would go outside and play. Now, Linda's sister also lived in this complex, so Linda already knew at least one person. But to Linda, making friends of her own was also pretty important to her. She was an outgoing person by nature, and also she was newly single and wanted to take her mind off her ex-boyfriend. Until recently, Linda had been dating this guy named Brendan Fowler, who had been great at first and was even the one who told her about this apartment complex, but he'd started to get really controlling and possessive, and just 2 days ago, Linda had finally ended things. But believe it or not, Linda actually felt sort of hopeful. She had believed that by leaving Alabama and moving to Florida into this complex, that would sort of be the refresh that she and her kids desperately needed. But the truth was, it sort of seemed like actually the true reset had been the breakup with Brendan just a couple of days earlier. Like it all needed to happen, all this big change in order for their lives to really get on the right track. And so, feeling optimistic, Linda looked into the cupboard at her limited ingredients and suddenly realized she could actually do a quick bean casserole with just these couple of things. So she grabbed the cans and the flour, and she got started. About a half an hour later, Linda pulled a beautiful golden brown casserole out of the oven and set it on the counter to cool. And that's when her older son, Jeff, wandered into the kitchen to see if dinner was ready. Linda told him it was, but they needed to wait for Tim to get home from football first. And when she said that, Jeff sort of blew up at her. He said he was really hungry right now, and there was basically no food in the house, and so he couldn't even eat anything else to tide himself over, like, come on, let me eat. Now, Jeff's reaction made Linda pretty mad, but at the same time, it didn't really surprise her. I mean, Jeff had been talking back to her a lot lately, and the two of them seemed to fight all the time. Linda knew he was sort of just being a typical teenager, and he was really hungry, and so he's testing her limits. But she was just getting really sick of it. And so before she could even really think about it, she snapped back at him and said, well, if you don't like it here, you can leave. And at that, Jeff literally stormed out of the house and slammed the door behind him. Linda went to the window and watched her son pick up his bike and pedal off down the road. After that, Linda sighed and walked over to her phone and called her mom. She assumed, Jeff, her son, would go to her parents' house since they lived nearby. And when Linda's mother picked up, Linda warned her that Jeff might be there soon and he'd likely want to eat. Her mom said that was fine and they would drop him back off after dinner. Then her mom said she actually was glad that Linda called because another letter came. And as soon as Linda heard that, she felt this wave of anxiety come over her because she knew what kind of letter she was talking about. So Linda's ex-husband and Tim and Jeff's dad, Frank Slayton, lived back in Alabama. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic, and they'd been divorced for 7 years. But Frank had never stopped harassing Linda after they broke up. And since Linda and the boys had moved to Lakeland, he had been mailing threatening letters to Linda's parents, saying that Linda had ruined his life. And so now Linda was thinking, no matter how many fresh starts she started, that Frank was always going to screw them up. He was never going to go away. And so after taking a calming breath, Linda told her mom on the phone to just rip the letter up. She didn't even want to read it. Not long after she hung up, her younger son, Tim, came in the front door. He was all sweaty and dirty from football practice, and right away, Linda asked him, hey, did you thank your coach for giving you a ride home? And Tim said, yes, I did. So Linda, she didn't have a car because she couldn't afford one, and so Tim's coach always had to give him a ride, but Tim said, I thanked him like always. And so Linda told him to hurry up and eat because they had to go next door to the neighbor's party. Hours later, after 11 p.m. that evening, Linda and Tim walked home from the party through the dark apartment complex. There were 7 other people who had been at the party, and it had been a lot of fun. Everybody just drank iced tea and played cards while they talked about the perks of living in this great new complex, like the great business district across the street and how responsive the maintenance team was. So Linda was glad they went. She was also exhausted, and her sister always came over for coffee in the morning, so she needed to go to bed now or she would never wake up. However, when she and Tim got back to their unit and opened up the door, Linda froze because there was already somebody inside. For a second, she thought it might be an intruder, but then she realized it was actually just her older son, Jeff, who had come back. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a sort of "I'm sorry" expression on his face. Tim saw the situation and immediately disappeared into the second bedroom to give his mother and brother some space. Linda went to join Jeff in the kitchen, but Jeff didn't say anything. So Linda spoke first and reminded him that it was not good to go to bed angry. However, Jeff still didn't say anything. And Linda knew from experience with her son, it was better not to force Jeff to talk. So she decided she would just give Jeff a minute, and she began washing the dishes. Finally, after a few moments, Jeff mumbled that he loved his mom, and Linda smiled. She felt relieved they could just move on from this. She said it was all good and that she loved him too. Then they both said goodnight, and Jeff went over to the cot in the living room where he slept, and then Linda wrapped up in the kitchen, turned off the lights, and headed into her own bedroom, closed the door, and she went to bed too. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., Linda's sister, Judy Butler, walked up to Linda's duplex. They'd had coffee together every morning since they moved to the neighborhood, so Judy expected to knock on her sister's door and go right in like she always did. But this time after she knocked, nobody answered. So Judy waited and then knocked again. And when there was still no response, Judy reached down and tried to open up the door, but she found it was locked. This had never happened before. Linda always answered the door, or at least called out in response. But Judy wasn't really worried. She just assumed, that Linda must have overslept or something. So Judy decided she would just go home for now and let her sister have a few minutes, and eventually she would call to check in on her and make sure she was okay. However, as she walked away from the home, she noticed something strange on the side of Linda's house. One of the back windows was missing a screen, and Judy knew that that particular room was Linda's bedroom, and it hadn't been like that yesterday. So seeing it now made her feel kind of uneasy, and so she went over to look inside. And when she looked inside, she saw her sister fast asleep in bed. And for a second, Judy was relieved, because this confirmed that this is all this was. Her sister had overslept, that's that. But then Judy realized there was something off about Linda, like the way she was positioned just seemed wrong. And when everything clicked for her, she staggered backwards and began to scream. By 9 a.m. on September 4th, 1981, a crowd of reporters and police officers surrounded the duplex in a Lakeland, Florida housing complex where a woman had reported seeing a dead body. In the middle of all the activity, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police ducked under some crime scene tape and headed to the home's walkway with a bag of equipment slung over his shoulder. So Pickett was actually just a year away from retirement after 2 decades as a detective, and for the last few years, he'd been the head of Lakeland's crime scene unit, which meant he oversaw the collection and documentation of evidence at crime scenes. And so he wasn't the lead investigator on this case, but when it came to forensic analysis and fingerprint collection, he was the best they had. He'd already been briefed on the situation and knew that this was very likely a homicide, and the victim had been identified as 31-year-old Linda Slayton. Linda had been found in her bedroom by her sister, who had asked a nearby maintenance worker to call 911. Pickett also knew that when the first responder got inside the house, they found that Linda's 2 kids were still asleep and appeared to have no idea their mother was deceased in the next room, which Pickett knew would give investigators somewhat of a timeline to start with. Linda was clearly awake when her kids went to sleep and must have died sometime during the night while her kids were still sleeping. As Pickett walked up the walkway, he passed by 2 teenage boys sitting in their pajamas on the ground. He assumed these must be the sons, and one of them just sort of stared ahead, seemingly in complete shock, while the other sort of sobbed into his brother's shoulder. Pickett wasn't sure if anybody had spoken to them yet, but he knew they would likely be really helpful in focusing his search for evidence. Since they lived in the house, they'd know the habits and patterns of everybody who lived there, and might be able to tell him if anything seemed out of place. So Pickett made a mental note to make sure to check in with the investigators inside about that. Then he looked at the house and took a deep breath. Pickett liked to get a sort of first impression of the crime scene before he did any actual collections. So before he would go in, he would walk around the entire house and sort of assess the building. He had been told that all the doors were locked when the police first got there. And from what he could see, the bedroom window with the missing screen was the only sign of a potential break-in. So he took out his kit and spent some time dusting around that window area for prints. But he didn't find much there, or any noticeable shoe impressions in the dirt outside. And then when he finally headed inside, Pickett quickly moved past all the officers and detectives that were already in there and went straight to the bedroom. And the first thing he saw when he got inside was Linda's body on the bed with a metal coat hanger wrapped around her throat. The sheets around her were covered in blood, and she was shirtless, and the bottom of her dress was pulled up. And when Pickett got closer, he saw where the blood had come from. There were long, very deep scratches on Linda's neck, which he guessed were from her nails as she tried to pry the hanger away. He'd have to wait for the autopsy, but it was clear from her wounds that the hanger had been used to strangle her. And considering she was partially naked and the positioning of her clothes, he guessed she had also been likely sexually assaulted. Pickett stepped back and looked around the room, trying to decide where to start. He needed to find as much forensic evidence in this room as possible. So the first thing he did was try and guess what happened and how the killer might have interacted with the crime scene. That way he could follow their sort of imagined path with more intention. He figured the killer must have come in through the open window, since that was the only entrance into the house that was obviously tampered with. Linda's purse and jewelry were still on the dresser, and the drawers were all closed, as opposed to open and rifled through, so it didn't seem like the killer had touched any of that stuff, which also meant this likely was not a robbery gone wrong. In fact, it seemed like the first and only thing the killer had done was come in through the window and attack Linda. Because aside from the bloody bed, Pickett didn't see any signs of a struggle. So Linda was likely caught off guard by a very fast attack and unable to really fight back quickly, because if she did, the room would be a huge mess. But then Pickett caught a glimpse of Linda's closet, and he noticed the clothes were all hanging on metal hangers that looked identical to the one that was around Linda's neck. And that's when it hit him. The killer must have at some point been in the closet, hiding. He supposed the killer could have broken in first and then grabbed a hanger once the attack started, but that would have taken too much time and also given Linda a chance to get off the bed or fight back or yell out and maybe wake her sons up. It was much more likely that the killer had broken in earlier, hid in the closet, and then waited until Linda was in her bed asleep to come out and attack. If Pickett was right about that, this became definitely a premeditated, thought-out murder, which meant the killer must have either known Linda personally or had been watching her, since they would have known when to sneak into the room and not be detected. At this point, Pickett took out his gear and began thinking how he was going to begin looking for evidence. He figured he would start at the window and spend some time there, and then he would go to the closet. Those would be his two primary areas. And so once he had that plan in mind, he went to the window and he began looking for evidence, and sure enough, after only a few minutes of dusting, he smiled. Because there, on the ledge, was a very clear, well-defined handprint. The following afternoon, over 24 hours after Linda's body had been found, Pickett sat in the precinct's fingerprint lab, comparing two sets of prints with a magnifying glass. He'd been at it for hours already, so his head was pounding. After processing the crime scene yesterday, Pickett had gone back to the station to review the evidence he'd collected. And while he was there, he decided he would go check in with the detectives to get an update on the case. And what they would tell him is they had spoken to the neighbors, as well as Linda's family, and they did have a few solid leads and a timeline. According to Linda's kids, the older son Jeff got dropped off at home at about 9:30 p.m. after being with his grandparents. And Tim, the younger son, and Linda had gotten back from a neighbor's party just after 11 p.m. They all went to bed around midnight, and neither of the brothers heard anything until the police woke them up the next morning. And all of this had led the investigators to agree with Pickett's initial interpretation of the scene, that Linda's attack was very fast. It seemed like she had not been able to even scream, or it would have woken up her sons. The autopsy report had also come in, and it confirmed Linda died from strangulation and was sexually assaulted. The medical examiner had also been able to collect semen from Linda's body, which meant they were definitely looking for a man here. And since this was now clearly a sexually motivated crime, it meant that anybody Linda had been romantically involved with was now suddenly a top suspect. After speaking with Linda's family, the detectives discovered that Linda had two serious ex-partners. She had her ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and an ex-boyfriend named Brendan Fowler. Frank apparently had abused Linda when they were married and still sent her very threatening letters. And Brendan was apparently very possessive with a bad temper, and Linda had broken up with him just 2 days before her murder. And so some officers were already out looking for both of these men, and Pickett was eager to get both of their prints. But for now, Pickett was actually more focused on Linda's neighbors. When the detectives had done their canvass initially, the neighbors they spoke to had confirmed that Linda and her younger son Tim were indeed at that party. And since these neighbors were some of the last people to see Linda alive, they weren't just witnesses, they were suspects. And so Pickett had collected fingerprints from all the men at that party who didn't have an alibi for the period of time after Linda went home. And that's what he was working on now, comparing those prints to the print he had found on the windowsill. So far, none were a match, but they had also gotten blood samples from the neighbors, and so Pickett would have to test those as well. So in 1981, DNA testing didn't exist yet, but investigators could figure out somebody's blood type through bodily fluids. So Pickett and his team could test those samples against the genetic material found on Linda's body and rule out suspects that way. But Pickett had another reason for wanting to be diligent when it came to testing the people who lived in the complex. It was because after Linda's murder, like in the last 24 hours, there had been signs that the killer might actually still be in the area. At 3 a.m. that morning, one of Linda's neighbors had called in to say a stranger had broken into her house. And even though that person was gone by the time the police arrived, they could see her back door had clearly been forced open. And then another neighbor had called in to say that the screen on their window was pried open as well. None of them were violent assaults like Linda's, but the timing was very suspicious. And it made Pickett wonder if there was a serial predator living in the complex. The department had ordered some patrols in the area, and Pickett was supposed to get fingerprints for whoever they got calls about. So he was working with his radio right next to him. Pickett leaned back in his chair to give his eyes a rest. He knew he was getting pretty tired and would need a break soon. But just seconds later, a detective barged into the lab and told Pickett they needed him on standby for fingerprinting because they just brought Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, in for questioning. Moments later, Pickett was standing outside of an interrogation room, listening as some detectives spoke with Brendan Fowler inside. Even though he couldn't see Brendan, Pickett could tell by his voice that he was not happy to be here. He sounded argumentative and defensive as he insisted he really had nothing to do with Linda's death. And when he was asked about where he was the night she died, he had an alibi. He said he was at home with his family, and he stayed there the whole night. He even gave detectives his mom's phone number and said they should call her to confirm it. Pickett heard the detectives confer in hushed voices. Then they asked Brendan if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test and let them take his fingerprints. And to Pickett's surprise, Brendan said, yeah, go ahead. And as soon as Pickett heard that, based on experience, he went right inside the room and got Brendan's fingerprints before Brendan could change his mind. On September 11th, so 1 week after Linda's murder, Pickett sat down at his desk and opened the newspaper, and what he saw made him cringe. The Lakeland police chief had just given an interview where he admitted they would not be making an arrest now or in the next few days. And reading that in print reminded Pickett of just how little they had in this case. None of the neighbors' prints had been a match to the one Pickett had lifted off the windowsill, and they'd tracked down Linda's ex-husband, Frank, but found that he was in Alabama on the night Linda was killed. As for Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, he had seemed pretty guilty at first because during his polygraph, the results had been inconclusive, and his alibi didn't check out. His family had said he was home at one point on the night Linda was killed, but they all went to sleep and couldn't say for sure if maybe he left or not. But when Pickett had looked at his prints, he had no choice but to clear him, because they clearly were not a match. So now Pickett knew the entire investigative team was scrambling for leads, which was why Pickett was not surprised by what he saw when he looked up from his paper. He saw a detective leading a suspect out of a precinct interrogation room after clearly questioning him, and it was Linda's own 15-year-old son, Jeff Slayton, and he was obviously crying. Pickett had heard that Jeff was being looked into as a suspect in his mother's murder, and had already been questioned a few times. Detectives had started getting interested in him when a few of Linda's family members mentioned that, Jeff and Linda had been fighting a lot before she died. And when investigators looked back at the crime scene photos, they realized Jeff's cot in the living room shared a wall with Linda's room. So it was strange he hadn't heard anything on the night she had died. But as far as Pickett knew, Jeff had a reasonable explanation for all of this. He had said that he and his mother's fights were not that serious, and they did fight the night she died, but it was over some dumb argument over what time dinner was. And he said he had no idea why he didn't wake up when she was attacked, because he wished he had so he could have gone in there and helped her. And also Jeff had taken and passed a polygraph test. But for some reason, it seemed like the investigative team was not done with Jeff, and Pickett just sort of felt bad for the kid, because he thought it was very unlikely at this point that Jeff was his own mother's killer. Pickett had kids of his own, and from his own experience, the fights Jeff was having with his mom just seemed sort of like typical teenage behavior, squabbling with their parents. It's pretty normal. And it also just didn't line up with the evidence. Pickett was absolutely certain that the attacker broke in through the window, which didn't make sense for Jeff if he was sleeping right next door in the living room. And Pickett had personally checked Jeff's prints against the one he lifted from the window, and he knew it was not a match. As the days turned into weeks, Pickett was starting to become convinced that the killer might be somebody without a personal connection to Linda. Maybe it was even a stranger. He knew that murders by strangers were much more rare than murders committed by a relative, partner, or friend, which was why he assumed the detectives weren't pursuing it. But through his forensics, Pickett had now eliminated pretty much everybody in Linda's life who had a motive or opportunity to kill her. And Linda was a very attractive young woman who was very outgoing. Pickett thought it was possible the killer could be a stranger who had only interacted with her once and then sort of became fixated on her. It seemed possible. And so after Pickett watched Jeff leave, he tried to go back to the newspaper, but he kept thinking about Linda. He'd been sure this case would be solved quickly by forensics, but now he wasn't sure if it would be solved at all. And that worry only got stronger and stronger as the months went by and fewer leads came in. And before long, a whole year had passed, and it was actually time for Pickett to retire. And when he left the precinct for the last time, he sort of had a pit in his stomach, because he had a feeling that without him, Linda's case was going to get put on a shelf and forgotten. One afternoon in the fall of 2001, so 2 decades after Linda Slayton was murdered, Detective Brad Grice sat in his office at the Lakeland Police Department reading over Linda's cold case file. For the last 4 years, Grice had been sorting through the department's cold cases and choosing which ones to reopen. And this had been a really slow process, because he had to do that and juggle his active caseload. So even though he'd technically been working on Linda's case for years, he was just now starting to really dig into it. But the delay didn't worry him too much, since the whole reason this case appealed to him was because he was sure he could solve it quickly. Because it had DNA evidence. So back in 1981, when the murder actually happened, the genetic material that was found on Linda's body was only good for eliminating suspects through blood type. But now, in 2001, Bryce could use that same material to create a full DNA profile of Linda's killer. And he intended on reaching out to everybody involved in the original investigation to get their DNA to test against this new profile. But before he did this, he wanted to familiarize himself with the suspects from 1981. So there was Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, who had abused Linda repeatedly during their marriage. And even though they had been divorced for years, he was apparently still sending her all these threatening letters around the time of her murder. And then her more recent romantic partner, Brendan Fowler, was known to have a bad temper and seemed very controlling of Linda. And they broke up only 2 days before her murder, so he could have still been furious about it. The neighbors at the party Linda had gone to were also suspects. Everybody in that group knew when Linda was heading home, so somebody could have maybe followed her and then snuck into her bedroom before she went to bed. And then finally, Jeff Slayton, Linda's oldest son, was actually in the house during the murder. His brother Tim had been too, but Jeff actually admitted to getting in a big fight with Linda earlier that same day. Now, all of these suspects had been cleared through fingerprints, alibi, or polygraphs. But Grice knew that DNA testing was way more accurate than any of those methods of elimination. And so basically, even if they'd been ruled out for one of those three things, DNA overrode that. And so he wasn't going to let these previous eliminations cloud his judgment. He'd already decided that, basically no matter what, he was just going to focus on whatever the forensics told him and not be biased. But for now, he just wanted to kick things off by speaking with the two people who'd known Linda better than anybody else. Her sons, Tim and Jeff. A few days later, Grice walked into a meeting room at the precinct where he'd been told Jeff and Tim Slayton were waiting. And as soon as he saw the brothers, he just started laughing because he realized he knew Jeff Slayton. They had bowled together for years, but it hadn't occurred to Grice that this Jeff was that Jeff. And Jeff recognized Grice at the same time. So they spent a while talking and laughing about what a crazy coincidence this was. And so when Grice finally sat down with Jeff and with Tim at the same time, Grice's first line of questioning was actually just pretty emotional. It just was like, hey, how are you guys holding up after this horrible thing? And for the next few minutes, the mood got pretty heavy as the two brothers spoke honestly about how terrible the last 20 years had been. After their mother had been killed, they both said they were terrified that, they were going to get hurt too, because the killer was never caught. They felt like, who's next? Jeff said he slept with a knife under his pillow, and he eventually got so depressed, he dropped out of high school. And Tim admitted he also struggled, but he took a different path. He relied on his football team and friends for support and kept pictures of all of them around his room to remind himself to stay positive. After that, the brothers shared what they could remember about the night their mother had died. But it was obvious to Grice that, Tim and Jeff didn't really have any information he didn't already have inside the case file. So instead of continuing to question them about details of the case, Grice explained that this murder was going to be solved through DNA. And because of that, he needed to collect samples from every person involved in this case, which included both of them. The brothers looked surprised for a moment, but then said, of course. So Grice stood up and said he would send a tech inside. But before he left, he promised them that he would find their mom's killer, and he was not going to retire until he did. Later that month, Grice sat in front of a screen in the station's computer lab, reading a police report from 1982. Since speaking to the two Slayton brothers, Grice had collected DNA from dozens of people who were involved in the case from 1981. Jeff, Tim, and also Linda's ex-husband Frank Slayton and her ex-boyfriend Brendan Fowler. He'd also tested the blood samples that the original investigators got from Linda's neighbors, but none of them matched the DNA profile for Linda's killer, which was disappointing because it meant that Grice had to basically start from scratch. But when he had gone back to the case notes, he noticed the mention of break-ins around the complex shortly after Linda's murder, and it made him wonder if Linda was killed by a serial predator who was in the area at the time. And if that was true, then this person would not have just hurt Linda, they would have other victims too. So Grice had run the killer's DNA through the FBI's database. And when it didn't match anything in there, he had reached out to the county sheriff's department to see if they could send him any cases that, felt similar to Linda's. And they had sent over the report that he was reading right now. And it felt incredibly promising. So in 1982, a year after Linda's murder, a man named Jimmy Ulmer was arrested for climbing through a 10-year-old girl's bedroom window, then assaulting and strangling her. And according to his file, Jimmy had this long history of home invasions and very violent behavior. And as soon as Grice finished reading the report, he jumped up and went to go find one of his officers. He wanted to dig up as much information on Jimmy as he possibly could and see if maybe they could go track him down. About a month later, Grice sat at his desk staring at his phone in anxious anticipation. He was waiting for an incredibly important call, one that would confirm whether Jimmy Ulmer was Linda's killer. After doing a background check on Jimmy, Grice had found out that Jimmy actually knew someone who lived at Linda's complex and was literally staying with them when Linda was killed. Now, Jimmy was not alive anymore, but they had gotten in touch with his mother, who gave them her DNA, which they were testing now. So this DNA would not be an exact match to the killer's DNA, but it would show if she was at least a relative to the killer. And as Grice waited for the lab to call, his heart was pounding, because for the first time since he'd picked up Linda's case, everything finally made sense now. Jimmy was this violent serial home invader who had probably seen Linda while staying at his friend's house and maybe stalked her until he saw an opportunity to attack. And then after he killed her, he must have compulsively kept breaking into other homes to find more victims. Just then the phone rang, and Grice picked it up, and he could feel his mouth going dry as he heard it was the lab on the other side. He was going to get an answer here. But just a second later, they told him it was not a match. Grice's stomach dropped, but he thanked them anyway, and he hung up. He couldn't believe it. Despite all the suspects and forensic evidence that they had, this case was once again at a dead end. Still, Grice kept pushing forward. As the months passed by, he would regularly find new suspects and eventually clear them. He also kept sending the killer's DNA profile to the FBI to run it through their database in case any new additions were, added in that could be a match. But eventually, over a decade passed by, and Grice still had not been able to match anybody to the killer's DNA. And in 2015, his own health began to decline, and he finally had to make the call he hoped he would never have to make. He picked up the phone and dialed Jeff Slayton's number. And when Jeff picked up, Grice said he did need to retire, and he still had not found his mother's killer. In June of 2019, 4 years into retirement, Grice sat on the deck of his Florida home reading a newspaper. He was deep in an article when his cell phone rang. And when he looked at the ID, he was surprised to see it was from the Lakeland Police Department. He had not gotten a call from them in years, so he immediately picked it up to see what they wanted. And when he did, the person on the other end introduced himself as the detective who had taken over the Linda Slayton case. The detective said they knew Grice was retired now, but they figured he would want to hear this. They said they had hired a genetic genealogist to track down family members of the killer based on the DNA profile that Grice had ordered. And through that process, they had finally been able to get a match. And after they did, they also managed to get the suspect's fingerprints. And those prints did match the palm print that the head of the crime scene unit, Sergeant Edgar Pickett, had taken at the original crime scene 38 years earlier. Grice sat up and listened intently as the detective finally told him who Linda's killer actually was. And when he heard the name, he couldn't believe it. That suspect had been so close the whole time. Based on DNA, forensic evidence, and 38 years of police investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linda Slayton in the early morning hours of September 4th, 1981. The house was all quiet as the killer waited patiently inside of Linda's closet. Hours earlier, when Linda was out, the killer had removed that screen from her bedroom window and crept inside. And then they had hid in this closet until she had come home. The killer had been watching Linda for a while now and finding ways to get close to her and her family. But Linda never really acknowledged them or paid any attention to them at all. Tonight, though, the killer was determined to show Linda that she was not the one in control. They were. And now, the killer stood in the dark closet, holding their breath as their heart pounded, and as they listened to Linda open her bedroom door and walk inside. And the killer continued to wait anxiously as they listened to the sound of Linda getting ready for bed and getting changed, and then eventually they heard the sound of the springs of the bed compressing as Linda laid down to shut her eyes for the night. And then after the killer was sure Linda was in bed, the lights are off, it's quiet in the room, they waited even longer just to make sure Linda was asleep and her children were asleep. And then finally, when the killer felt like they had waited long enough, they grabbed a coat hanger off the hook in the closet and then burst out of the door. And then before Linda could do anything, make a sound, even react, she's totally caught off guard, the killer was on top of her and had wrapped the coat hanger around her throat. Linda struggled and clawed at her throat to try to get this thing off of her, but the killer was so much stronger than her, and there was nothing she could do. It didn't take long for the killer to have their way with Linda, and then after they were done, they strangled her until she was dead. And once the killer was done, they hopped off the bed and just climbed right back out the same window they had come in through and wandered off into the night.
And the killer would get to replay this crime over and over in their head all day the next day until it was time for football practice. It would turn out Linda was murdered by her son's football coach, Joseph Mills. Joseph was a fixture in Tim's life and would drive him to and from practice every day because Linda didn't have a car. But while Tim saw Joseph as a mentor in his life, Joseph had apparently just developed a total fixation on his mother. And during all those trips to her house to drop off her son, Joseph was planning out how and when to attack her. Back in 1981, Joseph was interviewed by police over the phone a day after Linda's murder, but he was never really considered an actual suspect. Instead, after Joseph murdered Linda, he just continued to drive her son Tim to and from football practice, and Tim would even very tragically begin to rely on Joseph for, emotional support, grieving the loss of his mother. But it's to her killer. He just didn't know. And then even more tragically, as time went on and Linda's case went cold, one of the pictures that Tim hung in his bedroom to remind himself to stay positive was of his football team. Tim had no idea that his mother's killer was literally standing right behind him in the back row in that picture. In December of 2019, Joseph was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery and was eventually sentenced to life in prison without parole.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One evening in April of 2006, a person sat at their kitchen table frantically cutting up the page of a newspaper with some scissors. They were working on a very important project, and it was almost done. They finished cutting up the final letter from the page and pasted it onto the sheet of paper. Then they leaned back to read the message that they'd assembled from the scraps. It was a warning, and they were sure it would have exactly the effect they were hoping for. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please rent a huge billboard on the side of the highway and just put a bunch of embarrassing photos of the like button on it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Sunday afternoon, March 12, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamiti Jr. drove his ATV across a frozen lake in Freedom, New Hampshire. And even though it was really cold and the air burned his cheeks and his lungs, Mike smiled as he drove. He really just loved it here. Most of the time, Mike lived 2 hours away in the town of Wakefield, Massachusetts. But he'd been coming to Freedom, New Hampshire for years because his parents had a vacation house here. And so this tiny lakeside community had always felt like a second home and a peaceful retreat. And Mike had recently bought his own vacation house in Freedom, just down the street from his parents. And the purchase had been a really big deal for him. He ran a cement contracting company called Allstate Concrete Pumping, and he'd worked really hard for many years to build up a nice life for his wife Michelle and their 3 kids. And in many ways, the purchase of the second house was proof that he'd done it. But his work with the concrete company had also created some issues in his marriage. Being in charge of a company meant a lot of responsibility and long hours. So Michelle and the kids were on their own quite a bit, which meant Michelle had to do most of the parenting and most of the household stuff. And she'd recently made it clear that Mike being gone all the time, despite how successful he was still really hard on her. Now, out on the lake, as Mike was kind of thinking about his whole life, Mike could see another ATV coming toward him. And as it got closer, he could see that the driver of the ATV was the other problem in his marriage, Sean Fitzpatrick. So Sean was one of their neighbors on the lake, and he'd been a close friend of the family for years. He was retired, and he lived in Freedom year-round, and when the Zamitis were there, he'd come over for dinners or barbecues or to take their kids boating out on the lake. He was around so much that Mike's kids actually called him Uncle Sean. But last summer, Mike had found out that his wife Michelle had cheated on him with Sean. Mike had been obviously completely devastated, but he and Michelle had both agreed not to give up on their marriage and had been going to therapy together ever since. And in terms of Mike and Sean's relationship, well, Mike still hadn't actually spoken to Sean since finding out about the affair, because mostly he just hated confrontation. It had been easier for him to avoid Sean and focus on rebuilding his relationship with Michelle. So seeing Sean now made Mike want to just turn around and speed off in the other direction. But Mike could see that Sean was already waving him down, so he came to a stop and waited there as Sean pulled his ATV up. And Sean did not beat around the bush. He immediately told Mike that he was glad he ran into him here because he'd been wanting to apologize about last summer and Michelle. It obviously wasn't okay, and he hoped they could just, put it behind them. And Mike, he was so surprised by how sincere Sean was being that he just said, you know what, it's all good. Which he didn't mean, because it definitely was not okay. But again, Mike's not a confrontational guy. All Mike really wanted to do here was get out of this interaction and get away from Sean, because this made him really uncomfortable. And also, he genuinely did need to leave basically right now, because he and Michelle and the kids were getting ready to head back to Wakefield soon, and he wanted to go help Michelle pack up. And so pretty quickly, Mike told Sean that he really had to go here. And then before, Sean could protest, Mike turned his ATV around and he gunned it back across the lake towards his house. About 15 minutes later, Mike walked into his house, and the first thing he saw was a bunch of suitcases all packed and sitting by the door. And he realized that, Michelle had already done all the work. But seconds later, Michelle came in and gave Mike a kiss. And she said, the kids were just finishing up cleaning their rooms and they could all head out in a few minutes. And then Mike heard the sound of a car beeping twice outside. And when he and his wife heard that, Michelle kind of rolled her eyes and laughed, because they both knew it was clearly Mike's parents. His parents had also been in Freedom for this weekend at their house down the street, and they were also making the 2-hour drive back to Wakefield this afternoon. And Michelle was laughing because it amused her that neither Mike nor his father could manage to go a single day without talking to each other. So Mike's dad was also named Michael, and the name was not the only thing they shared. They were also best friends and co-workers. Michael Sr. owned the company that Mike ran, Allstate Concrete. So it was like a family operation, and Mike Jr. had never even thought of doing anything else. He jumped into the concrete business right out of high school, and he and his dad had been working together ever since. Now, the Allstate Concrete Company had some struggles, just like any company would, including a lawsuit from a former employee that had been pretty stressful. But for the most part, the business was a huge success, and right now they were busier than ever, working on an enormous construction project in nearby Boston. So Mike headed outside to say hi to his parents and to talk a little business with his dad. He asked Mike Sr. if he'd called their employee, Chester Roberts, yet, because Mike and his dad had plans to be at the office first thing tomorrow morning, and Mike wanted Chester to be there too. Chester worked part-time for them as a driver and also handyman, and he was easily the most reliable employee that they had. So whenever they had a packed week ahead, they always called Chester in. And to Mike Jr.'s relief, Mike Sr. said yes, he'd already spoken to Chester, and they were good to go. So eventually, they all said their goodbyes, and Mike Jr. told his dad he would see him tomorrow. Just before 8 a.m. the next morning, Monday, March 13th, Mike Jr. pulled his truck into the parking lot of Allstate Concrete. He was right on time. He could see he was the first vehicle there, so he got out and hustled across the lot because it was raining, and he unlocked a side door by one of the garage doors. So the Allstate building was basically just a massive garage with 3 huge roll-up doors for their cement trucks to pull into. But it also had an upstairs office where Mike and his father did all their administrative work. And so after Mike went in through the side door into the big garage, he headed up a set of steps that led to his office on the second level. And when he got there, he sat in his desk chair and started going over the week's logistics. And just a few minutes later, he heard another vehicle pull into the lot outside. Mike figured that very likely this was his father, because Chester often came to the office on foot. Then Mike Jr. heard the downstairs door open and footsteps coming up the stairs. A few minutes later, Mike's father, Mike Sr., pulled his truck into the Allstate Concrete parking lot and parked next to his son's truck. He hopped out and walked quickly to the building's side door to get out of the rain, but when he tried to push open the side door, it got stuck on something and wouldn't open all the way. So he looked through the crack to see what was blocking the door, and he froze. because there was clearly a man lying face down inside of the building in a huge pool of blood. Now, it was dark inside the building, and so Michael Sr. could not see the man's face. He had no idea who this guy was. But whoever it was, he knew sort of instinctively that it was not his son. Mike Jr. was a big guy, and even in the dark, it was clear this man had a different build. And so Michael Sr.'s heart was pounding now, and all he could think to do was just back away, grab his cell phone, and call 911. However, after Michael Sr. got off the phone with the dispatcher and they said they were sending people over now, Mike Sr. realized he couldn't just wait for the police to get there. I mean, there was clearly someone either very badly hurt or dead in his garage, and his son was likely somewhere inside too. I mean, his truck was here. And so he had to go in and make sure his son was okay. So Michael Sr. walked away from the blocked door where he had been standing when he called the police, and he pulled up one of the big roll-up garage doors. And once it was open, he didn't see anyone. He just ran inside and began frantically screaming his son's name. But Mike Jr. didn't answer, and there was no sign of him anywhere. So eventually, Mike Sr. ran to the staircase and went up to the second-floor office. And as soon as Mike Sr. barged into the office, he stopped in horror. Because there, sitting slumped in the desk chair, was the blood-covered body of his son. Over an hour later, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled up in front of Allstate Concrete. He could see the large building was already roped off with caution tape, and there were a dozen or more crime scene techs and officers with the Wakefield Police Department who were moving in and out of an open garage door collecting evidence. So Baker was not a part of the Wakefield Police Department. He was with the state police. But in Massachusetts, state troopers conduct homicide investigations right alongside local authorities. And Baker had a feeling that this case would definitely need his help. Because Wakefield, they didn't get many homicides. The town was about 10 miles north of Boston and had a reputation as being a really peaceful and safe place. The kind of small town where everyone actually knew each other. Baker got out of his cruiser and looked around for whoever was in charge. And he didn't have to wait long, because an officer hurried up to him and introduced himself as Detective Richard Cass with the Wakefield Police Department. Cass told Baker to follow him, and as they walked towards the open garage door, he quickly briefed Baker up on the situation. There were 2 male victims inside, and both were deceased. They'd both been shot, and they had been found by the company's owner, Michael Zametti Sr., a little after 8 a.m. Baker followed Cass into the garage and over to the first body, which was face down on the floor just inside a smaller side door. Cass explained that this victim was 51-year-old Chester Roberts, a part-time truck driver for Allstate. It hadn't been difficult to identify him because Chester did a lot of handiwork around town and was known by all the locals, including Detective Cass himself. When Baker went to the body, he could tell right away that Chester had been shot in the back. It was a single shot and most likely was from a shotgun, since clearly there was a blast radius where there was like a spray effect with a lot of little pellets that entered his body. Chester had no other visible injuries, including no defensive injuries. And when Baker stood and looked around the garage, he also didn't see anything that pointed to a robbery or any kind of struggle. There was pretty pricey-looking equipment just sitting around, and nothing was toppled over or obviously out of place. So Baker guessed that Chester's killer had likely snuck up on him and shot him in the back before he even had a chance to turn around. Baker spent a couple more minutes looking around at the doors and the windows, and again, didn't see any signs of, forced entry or anything out of the ordinary, but that didn't mean much. Chester had likely opened up for the day and begun work, and the killer had just come in after him. And so after a few minutes, when Baker was done looking around the first floor, he told Cass he was ready to go up to the second floor to see the second body. Moments later, Cass led Baker into the second-floor office, where the body of 39-year-old Mike Zametti Jr. had been found. Detective Cass said sadly that, just like with Chester, he knew Mike personally as well. Mike Jr. had not just been shot in the torso the way Chester had been shot. He had been shot in the face as well as in the chest. And the force of these shots had been so powerful that, like his desk and surrounding paperwork were also all drenched in blood. And for the most part, Mike was basically unrecognizable. But what struck Baker the most was not just how gruesome this was. It was the fact that, Mike Jr. is still kind of slumped in his chair. He's in his office. Whoever did this, it's like they went in here to execute Mike, really intentionally.
They marched in here, they didn't touch anything else, and they shot Mike right in the face with a shotgun before Mike could even get up. I mean, this seemed very intentional. Somebody came here to kill Mike. And so as Baker was thinking about that, he realized that this likely meant Mike Jr. was the one who actually got shot first, before Chester had even arrived at the building. Otherwise, Mike Jr. would have heard the gunshot downstairs, and he wouldn't have been so caught off guard sitting in his chair like this. And so again, if Mike was the first person shot, it just further suggested that he was the main target of this attack. The crime scene, of course was gruesome, but considering it was remarkably clean. I mean, there were no bloody footprints or any indication the killer had interacted with the scene. And the Zamitis did fit the mafia stereotype, an Italian-American family involved in construction. Baker told Cass what he was thinking, sort of as he was surveying the scene here. And Cass, as he heard this, he sort of had this thoughtful look come over his face. He said he knew the Zamitis pretty well, and Mike Jr. and his father were really good people. So he found it hard to believe they were involved in any kind of shady, mafia business deals. But he conceded that it was possible, especially since the Zamitis were contractors on a project called the Big Dig. And this made Baker immediately raise his eyebrows. So the Big Dig was literally the biggest construction project in the country and involved building a tunnel under the harbor in Boston. But it had been kind of like a total disaster, just a major headache for the city since it was way over budget and had been going on for 15 years and still wasn't done. This huge project had also been famously hampered by mafia dealings and corrupt payoffs. So now Baker had to wonder if the Zamitis had either been involved in these seedy deals or had maybe accidentally upset the wrong person while on the job. But even if the murders had nothing to do with the mob, Baker still thought it was very likely that the killer was somehow connected to their business. Somebody who maybe had worked at Allstate Concrete, or maybe who had been a client, and would know where Mike worked in the building, and that he'd be there early in the morning. And while the second victim, Chester, was probably not the primary target, Baker wasn't sure yet why he was also killed. He could have been killed because he was just at work at the wrong moment, or maybe he was wrapped up in the same conflict as the Zamitis. So for a moment, Baker just stood there staring at the scene, staring at the blood-soaked paperwork all over the desk. And then eventually he turned to Cass and said they would need a list of all of Allstate's employees and clients. Baker then spent some more time just kind of walking around the office looking for evidence, and he noticed a 16-gauge shotgun shell on the floor. So he grabbed a nearby tech and told her to bag it and see if she could locate any other shells. Baker and Cass then headed outside, where already a crowd of people were gathering outside around the outside of the police perimeter. Once they were outside, Trooper Baker asked Cass if they could start by speaking with the person who actually discovered the bodies, Michael Zameti Sr. But Detective Cass shook his head and said no. He explained when he'd first gotten to the scene that Michael Sr. had been so distraught over his son's death that he could barely speak, so Cass had just sent him home. Another Wakefield police officer had done the same thing when Mike Jr.'s wife, Michelle Zameti, showed up, totally hysterical, saying she had heard there was an accident, and they had told her that her husband was dead and taken her home too. Baker understood, but was not thrilled to hear this. He preferred to speak to witnesses and family really quickly and in person. In a murder, a spouse is always a suspect, so he was especially disappointed to have missed Michelle. But there was still plenty to do at the scene, and obviously the Wakefield police knew where the family could be found later. So Baker turned to Cass and suggested they just start canvassing the businesses nearby. The following morning, March 14th, Trooper Baker parked his car in front of Mike's parents' house in Wakefield. He was with Detective Cass, and they were there to speak with Mike Sr. They'd just gotten the autopsies back for both Chester and Mike, but they didn't reveal anything that they didn't already know. Chester had been shot once, Mike twice, and both died likely within seconds. But the investigators did have one potential lead from their canvass of the neighborhood. Even though they hadn't found any surveillance cameras at Allstate Concrete, some businesses around Allstate had some. So Baker had some officers scrubbing through that footage now. He also had another team interviewing Chester Roberts' family, because there was still a chance that Baker had gotten this all wrong and maybe Chester was actually the target. Besides that, the crime techs had not found much physical evidence at the scene. There were no fingerprints, and since it had been raining, they hadn't been able to collect any footprints or car tracks from outside.
So now, Baker reached up and knocked on the front door of the Smitty's house, hoping that Mike Sr. would be able to point them in the right direction. A minute later, Baker and Cass sat in the living room with Mike Sr. and Pat, Mike's mom. Both of Mike's parents seemed incredibly emotional. Michael Sr. was visibly shaking, while Pat just cried. And seeing how upset they were now made Baker realize that Cass had made the right call in sending Michael Sr. home yesterday. Even 24 hours later, it was still going to be very hard to get any sort of real answer out of them because of how upset they were. So Baker decided he would just have to keep it really brief. The first thing he did is he asked Mike Sr. to just go over the actual discovery of the bodies. Tell me what happened. And what he said lined up with everything that Baker had heard from Cass and from dispatch. And so after Mike Sr. went over that, Baker moved on to the real reason he was there. He asked if there was anybody in Mike Jr.'s life who might have wanted to hurt him. Mike Sr. took a few shaky breaths as he thought about the question, and then he said that, there were a few people in the industry that he and his son did not necessarily get along with, but mostly they tried to have good relationships with everyone. Getting in fights was just bad business. But as he was saying this, Mike Sr. suddenly sat up straighter, like he just thought of something. And he said, actually, there was a former coworker who did definitely have a grudge against them. His nephew, Hank Jennings. Hank got mad at them a few years ago about unpaid overtime wages and actually filed a lawsuit against them. Now, they'd eventually paid Hank a settlement, but they still all hated each other. Mike Sr. looked over at his wife, Pat, and she just nodded and said the whole thing had been really high stress and very volatile. Baker took down Hank's information and talked with Mike's parents for just a few more minutes, and then he nodded to Cass, and they stood to leave. Baker knew he still needed to speak more to the Smitties, but for now, he was going to give them a break, and instead, he and Cass would look into Hank. 2 days later, Baker sat in Cass's office at the Wakefield Police Department, poring over crime scene photos and witness statements. He was starting to get antsy. After meeting with Mike's parents, he'd been excited to speak with Hank Jennings, the disgruntled former employee who also happened to be Mike's cousin. But even though Baker and Cass had sent officers out to track Hank down for an interview, they hadn't been able to get a hold of him yet. However, they had gotten in touch with Mike's wife, Michelle, and had questioned her at her house in Wakefield, but she hadn't given them much. She said that she was at home with her kids at the time of her husband's death, and that she really didn't know of anybody who would want to hurt Mike Jr. Also, Baker and Cass had looked into Allstate Concrete's financial statements, and they had found nothing that suggested there was anything shady or mafia-related happening with the company. Still, Baker knew they were better off than they had been a few days ago, primarily because they had had a chance to review a bunch of the surveillance footage from the businesses around Allstate, and one of those security cameras had been aimed at the street right outside Allstate. Now, this angle didn't show the Allstate parking lot itself, but it did show everyone who entered and exited that parking lot from the street. So, this particular camera had picked up Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m., and then at 7:44 a.m., so 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck pulled in as well. And then a few minutes after that, Chester Roberts was seen arriving at Allstate on foot. And then at 7:50, the green truck was seen again, leaving the parking lot, 12 minutes before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02. So, whoever the killer was, it looked like they had driven that green truck and had killed Mike and Chester between 7:44 a.m. and 7:50 a.m. The video wasn't clear enough to show the driver of this mysterious green truck or even see its plates, and it didn't actually show the driver of this vehicle, the killer, getting out of the vehicle and entering the building. But knowing the style and color of very likely the killer's vehicle would definitely help them narrow down potential suspects. Just then, the desk phone rang, and Baker watched as Cass grabbed it and said hello. And then Cass got a confused look on his face before he thanked the caller and said they'd be right over. He hung up and told Baker that was Michelle Zametti, and she'd called to say that she had new information to give them, something that she hadn't mentioned in her first interview, and that it was really important. About 15 minutes later, Baker and Cass sat down across from Michelle in her living room for the second time. And to Baker, Michelle seemed very different from the last time they spoke. 2 days ago, she'd seemed horrified and grief-stricken. But now, she just seemed really nervous. She kept touching her hair and fiddling with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table. Baker commented that there were a lot of cards, and Michelle just nodded. She said so many people had reached out and sent cards, all their friends and neighbors in Wakefield and in Freedom, New Hampshire, where their second home was. And then Michelle took a breath and just got straight to the reason that she had called them. She said that she had withheld information about one of her neighbors in Freedom. His name was Sean Fitzpatrick, and she'd had an affair with him. Baker cleared his throat in surprise and then asked her to go on. Michelle's eyes filled with tears as she explained how Mike Jr. worked so much and she and the kids spent a lot of time at their lake house, and so that meant they spent a lot of time with Sean. And eventually this friendship between Michelle and Sean had grown into a romance. Baker couldn't believe he was hearing this. A secret love triangle gave both Sean and Michelle plenty of motivation to want Mike dead. But before he could ask any follow-up questions, Michelle said her husband actually knew all about her affair and that they had been in therapy and they'd begun to completely turn their marriage around. So finally, a month ago, she'd officially totally broken things off with Sean, and Sean had been really upset about it. Baker shared a look with Cass and could tell they were both thinking the same thing. Obviously, they needed to speak to Sean immediately. But also, Michelle was now back to being a primary suspect too. Maybe she had wanted her husband out of the picture so she could be with Sean, and maybe the only reason she was telling them this was to get ahead of it. However, they would need a lot more evidence before they could prove any of that. So for now, Baker just got Sean's number and address from Michelle and told her they would be in touch. Later that night, Baker and Cass were once again inside of Cass's office, but this time they were there with another officer who was there to give them a crucial update. After speaking with Michelle, Baker had sent a team of officers up to Freedom, New Hampshire to speak with Sean, the neighbor she had been having an affair with. And now, one of those officers was back in Wakefield to tell them what he had learned. And the first thing Baker wanted to know was not about their conversation. It was just, did you see a green truck in Sean's driveway? But the officer shook his head and said Sean did own a truck, but it was bright red. Then he went on to say that when they had spoken to Sean, he had completely denied having an affair with Michelle. Sean had admitted that he had dated a lot of girls, but he'd insisted that he and Michelle were just close family friends. Now, the officers who were there speaking to Sean just stood there and let Sean talk, never telling him that they already knew that Michelle fully admitted to them having an affair, and they knew Sean was lying here. Baker almost laughed when he heard this because he did not believe Sean at all. And if he was lying like he appeared to be, that made him seem pretty guilty. But before he could say so, the officer added one more thing. He said Sean actually had a solid alibi. He'd been at home on the morning of the murders, and one of his neighbors had actually confirmed it. This particular neighbor took her morning walk every day at 9 a.m., and she'd seen Sean outside his house right around then. Baker sighed. It took around 2 hours to drive between Freedom and Wakefield, so Sean would not have had enough time to kill Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. and then get to Freedom by 9. And so suddenly, Sean Fitzpatrick felt like another very promising dead end. On March 18th, so 5 days after the murders of Mike Zimetti and Chester Roberts, Detectives Baker and Cass stood at the back of a church in Wakefield, Massachusetts. They were there for Mike's funeral, and the church was absolutely packed. But the investigators were not just there to pay their respects. They were also there to speak to Hank Jennings, the cousin of Mike who had filed that lawsuit against the concrete company. Since by that point they still had not been able to officially get a hold of Hank, Cass had suggested that they just corner him at Mike's funeral, which he was very likely to attend because, despite his rift with the Zimettis, he was still family. And when the service wrapped up and everybody stood to leave, Baker felt a nudge on his arm. Cass leaned over and whispered that they'd been right, and he pointed out Hank right in the crowd. So, as the attendees started filing out of the church, the investigators pushed their way over to Hank and got in front of him just before he could step outside. Baker immediately noticed that Hank's whole body went tense when they blocked his way, like he wanted to try to make a run for it. So Baker just cut to the chase, and he said, "Hank, will you come with us and speak to us, please?" And Hank's eyes got really wide, and he just said, "No way, not without his lawyer." Then he pushed past the investigators and hurried outside. Baker and Cass didn't follow him. Instead, they just exchanged a look, because they knew now that Hank was obviously their primary suspect. 5 weeks after the funeral, in mid-April of 2006, State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office in the Wakefield Police Department. He was wearing gloves, and he was holding a piece of paper that looked like an old-fashioned ransom note. It was covered in letters that had been clearly cut out of a newspaper, and it spelled out a very alarming message. Close business now, or more family will die. This message had been brought to them by Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat, who said they had received it in the mail that morning. For the Zemedis, for so many reasons, this letter was terrifying. It was not just a reminder of their son's murder, but also a promise that there would be more violence. But for Baker, the note was a lead, which they really needed, because it had been over a month since Michael and Chester were killed, and at this point, the two investigators had managed to rule out basically every one of their suspects, and that included Hank Jennings. They'd learned that Hank's clear reluctance to meet with them was not because of guilt. It was because he had signed a non-disclosure agreement during the settlement with the Zemedis and didn't want to break it. And when they did finally speak to him, he clearly had an alibi. He was at work when Mike and Chester were killed, and Baker and Cass had confirmed it with his employer. And while Hank did own some shotguns, none of them were 16 gauge. So Hank joined the pile of other discarded suspects, like Michelle, who could have had the motive to kill Mike Jr. since she was wrapped up in an affair with their neighbor, but she'd been incredibly cooperative, and they hadn't been able to find any evidence that she might have been involved, like maybe if she had hired someone or something. And her ex-lover, Sean, was also very suspicious and had a strong motive to kill Mike, but his alibi had cleared him. There was no way Sean could have been in Wakefield during the murders because his neighbor saw him about an hour later at his home, which was over 100 miles away. And so now this warning note that looked like a ransom note seemed to point back towards the theory that Baker and Cass had ruled out at the very beginning, that the murders were business-related and the mafia was involved. Cass was a local, and he'd told Baker that there had been a lot of rumors swirling around about the murders in the community. Because of the Zemedis' role in the Big Dig, the general consensus around Wakefield was that the mob theory made the most sense. But Baker really wasn't so sure. I mean, they'd looked into the Zemedis' books and records repeatedly, and they hadn't seen anything to suggest any shady deals or potential mob interaction. Also, Baker didn't think this ransom-style note made from newspaper clippings was the mob style. It just felt kind of silly and performative. Like maybe somebody was trying to make it seem like the mob to lead the investigation in the wrong direction. But even if that was the case, this note was still huge, because maybe whoever had sent it had left their fingerprints or DNA on it. So Baker bagged up the note, and Cass carried it off to send to the crime lab. Baker knew the results from the lab would not be immediate, so while they waited, he wanted to re-interview all their suspects and all their witnesses in case they'd overlooked anything. A few days later, Baker sat alone at Cass's desk, reading another witness statement. He'd been revitalized by all the new evidence they'd gathered and was feeling really optimistic about their ability to solve this thing. Aside from conducting new interviews, they had gotten some forensics from that ransom letter. The lab had found both DNA and a palm print on it. Now, they just needed a suspect to compare it to. And just then, the office door flung open and a very excited Cass barged in. An hour later, Baker and Cass walked up the front steps at Michelle Zemedi's house, and they knocked on her front door. When she answered, they asked her for permission to come inside and take a certain small object from her house. And after Michelle, who was sort of confused by what they were asking for, said, "Okay, come on in," they went right past her, went straight to this object, they bagged it, went right back outside, and sent it off to the crime lab. And as soon as the lab test results came back, Baker and Cass knew they had solved the case. Based on DNA, other forensic evidence, and witness statements, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael Zemedi Jr. and Chester Roberts on the morning of March 13th, 2006. At 7:45 a.m., the killer crept up the stairs that led to Mike's office. They had a shotgun with them, and their heart was racing. They were very nervous about what they were about to do. But Mike Jr., he had to go, and that was all there was to it. So when the killer reached the office door, they barely hesitated before pushing it open and raising their shotgun. Mike was sitting in a chair at his desk, and when the door opened, he turned towards the killer,
And when Mike Jr. saw them standing there with a gun pointed at them, his eyes got wide, but the killer fired 2 blasts before Mike could even move, hitting Mike in the face and in the chest. Mike immediately slumped over in his seat and stopped moving, and the killer ran back down the stairs to the garage. But before they could leave, they froze, because they could hear footsteps approaching the building's side door from outside. And so the killer instinctively just hid, not really sure what they were going to do, waiting for this person to either come inside or leave. And then once this person did come inside, it was a man, it was Chester, the killer leapt out and shot him right in the back, and he dropped to the ground, dead. And after killing Chester, the killer felt shocked. I mean, they hadn't planned on killing a second person today. Mike was the target. But they also knew they couldn't just wait around for more people to arrive. So the killer at this point left the building and jumped into the truck they had stolen from one of their neighbors. Then they peeled out of the parking lot less than just 10 minutes after they'd arrived. As they drove, they gripped the wheel tightly, and they knew they should feel guilty about what they had just done. But instead, all they felt was relief, because now they could finally be with the love of their life. It would turn out Michael Smitty Jr. and Chester Roberts were not murdered by Mike's wife Michelle, or Mike Jr.'s cousin Hank, or the mob. They were killed by Mike Jr.'s lakeside neighbor and his wife's lover, Sean Fitzpatrick. When Michelle tried to break things off with Sean, she said the only reason she would ever leave Mike was if Mike ended things, or if something happened to him. Now, Michelle meant that as an excuse, but Sean took it as a suggestion. So then he murdered Mike Jr. to steal his wife. Sean took that green pickup truck from a neighbor who was out of town, and then drove it to Wakefield, committed the murders, and then came back. That neighbor who said they saw Sean at his house in Freedom at around 9 a.m. that basically made it impossible for Sean, based on timing, to have gone, committed the murders, and came back. Well, that neighbor called to amend their statement, saying that actually they had seen Sean later in the day. And that change created enough time, enough of a window on the day of the murders, that it was absolutely possible that Sean could have driven, done the murders, and come back. And so once Sean's alibi fell apart, investigators remembered that stack of condolence cards at Michelle's house. So they went over to see if maybe Sean had sent one. And he had. And when they tested the envelope flap, which he had licked to seal it, they got his DNA. Then they matched it to the very threatening letter that sort of looked like a ransom letter that had been given to the Zamitis, which Sean had put together and sent to them in order to throw police off his trail and make them think that, yeah, the mob was involved here. In June of 2006, Sean Fitzpatrick was arrested and eventually received 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Michael Smitty Jr. and Chester Roberts. Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never before heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One day in January of 2018, a police officer walked through the woods near the small town of Gray, France. And as he walked, he was looking at the ground because he was following a literal trail of blood. And this trail eventually led the officer to the body of a person who clearly had been shot in the head. Now, this appeared to be a suicide, but the police officer had some questions, because this was not the first body that had been found in these woods near the small town in France. Another body had been found a couple of months earlier, and it was starting to seem like there was a pattern here. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you make coffee for the like button, don't use a coffee filter so there's just a ton of grinds in their drink. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story.
At around 5 p.m. on the evening of October 27, 2017, a 29-year-old woman named Alexia Duval drove her car down a cul-de-sac in the small, quiet town of Gray, France. She was on her way to her parents' house to celebrate her nephew's second birthday, and it was going to be this big family get-together. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and her little nephew had come in all the way from Paris, which was about a 4-hour drive away. But Alexia realistically had mixed feelings about seeing them all tonight. So Alexia had been going through a pretty hard time recently. She and her husband of 13 years, Jonathan, had been trying to get pregnant, and so she'd done several rounds of fertility treatments, which had thrown her hormones completely out of whack and seemed to affect her a lot more than was typical for most women. And then finally, when all that had led to her actually getting pregnant, she unfortunately had miscarried just a couple of months ago. And so even though Alexia loved her sister's family and got along with them really well, her miscarriage was still really fresh in her mind, and she just knew it was going to be very difficult for her to be around her young nephew. It was just a reminder of what she had lost. Now, Alexia came to a stop outside of a gated driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac, and she rang the intercom. And then when the gate opened up, she drove up the driveway toward a nice house with a very well-kept garden. She parked her car in the driveway behind her father's white van, and then got out of her car. She grabbed a wrapped present out of the back seat, along with a couple of desserts that she'd made, carried them up to the house, and rang the doorbell. And a few seconds later, her mother, Isabelle Fouillot, answered the door with a big smile and led her into the dining room where Alexia's father, Jean-Pierre, sat at the table, talking with Alexia's brother-in-law, Gregory, and also her sister, Stephanie. They all stood up and they greeted her, and then as Alexia began to explain that her husband Jonathan was running late and he'd be here later in a separate car because the job he'd been working that day as an electrician had run long, as she was saying all that, Alexia heard the sound of little feet making their way towards her. A moment later, her 2-year-old nephew, James, ran around the corner and threw his arms around Alexia's legs. And surprisingly, to Alexia's relief, she didn't feel sadness. All she felt was happiness. And so she bent down and scooped him up and gave the boy a big hug, and then she also handed him his birthday present. Eventually, the group settled in for dinner, and for a while, all of Alexia's worries just kind of faded away. She was really close with everybody at the table, especially her mother and her sister Stephanie, and being around them always put her in a good mood. Alexia's husband, Jonathan, finally arrived sometime around 8:30, and he, along with the rest of the group, had a wonderful night, eating and drinking and chatting. After dinner was cleaned up, Alexia's father did go to bed, but everybody else stayed up, and they all just continued having this nice time until around 11 p.m., when Alexia said it was really time for her and Jonathan to head home. They both had early mornings ahead of them. Jonathan had some errands to run in the morning, and Alexia was hoping to get a workout in. A few minutes later, on the drive home, Alexia sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan's car. She'd left her own car at her parents' house because she'd been drinking, and she was planning to pick it up when they came back the next day. Alexia and Jonathan's house was on a quiet residential street, only about a mile away from Alexia's parents' house. And as they made their way down the road, Alexia glanced out the window at a particular house that was just up the street from where they lived. And as she looked at it, she frowned. The neighbor who lived in that house had an adult grandson who had been harassing Alexia all summer. He'd been obsessed with her and would call and text her constantly, to the point where Alexia didn't feel safe even going out for a jog around the block when she was by herself. Now, fortunately, the harassment had stopped a couple of months ago, but only because the man had been committed to a mental hospital. But Alexia didn't really know how long it would be until he got out again, or if he'd already been released. She didn't know, so it just sort of felt like a reprieve, not a long-term solution. But on this night at least, there was nobody peering out at her from the neighbor's window. A minute later, their car pulled into their garage, and Alexia and Jonathan got out. And as Alexia went from the garage into the main house, she passed by a treadmill in the corner of the garage, which had broken down a few weeks ago. She asked Jonathan if he'd gotten around to fixing it yet, and he said no. Alexia just sighed. It was supposed to be a very cold and gloomy morning the next day, and so it looked like she was going to have to run outside. The following morning, around 11 a.m., Jonathan walked up to the door of Alexia's parents' house and rang the doorbell. And as he did, he sort of gave a worried look over his shoulder at Alexia's car, which was still parked where they'd left it the night before. Jonathan took a deep breath and tried not to show how anxious he felt as Alexia's mother, Isabelle, answered the door. And then, in a very shaky voice, Jonathan said hello and asked her if she'd seen or heard from her daughter recently. And when Isabelle said she had not,
Jonathan completely lost his composure. He said that morning Alexia had gone out for a jog, but not come back, and now he was starting to get really worried. He explained that he'd tried texting Alexia, but she still hadn't answered, and by this point, she should have been home a long time ago, so something was wrong. A moment later, Jonathan saw Stephanie and Gregory coming out of the guest room with very concerned looks on their faces. They joined Jonathan and Isabel at the front door and asked what the commotion was about. And so Jonathan sort of frantically re-explained the situation and asked if either of them had heard from Alexia in the last hour or so. But they shook their heads and said they hadn't. But Stephanie showed Jonathan that she had received a text from Alexia at 9:30 that morning, just to say that she was going out for this jog. But after that, none of them had received any texts or calls from Alexia. Jonathan was crying at this point, and so Alexia's family tried to assure him that, Alexia would probably just show up at the house any minute here, like nothing's going on. I'm sure she's just running late. And Jonathan, he wanted to believe this, but this was completely unusual. Like, this was not normal for Alexia to be gone for this long without being in touch. It just didn't make sense. It was at this point that Jonathan's brother-in-law, Gregory, reached out and put his hand on Jonathan in a sort of comforting way and just said, look, if it makes you feel any better, I'll go back with you and we can literally go look for Alexia together, or at least be together until she comes back. Jonathan didn't really know what to do, but he was very thankful and said, yep, that would be great. And so a couple of minutes later, the two men got in Gregory's SUV and they began driving back towards their house. But Jonathan actually navigated him through the streets along the running route that Alexia usually took to see if maybe they could find her. They drove down all the side streets looking for her. And then when they reached the edge of town, Jonathan and Gregory got out of the car and began checking the paths leading into the countryside and also the ditches and the banks of the river. But they didn't find Alexia anywhere. And then eventually they just drove back to Jonathan and Alexia's house to see if maybe she'd finally come home with an explanation for all this, but she had not come home. At this point, Jonathan was completely beside himself, and so Gregory, doing his best to stay calm, said, you know what, let's go to the hospital and see if Alexia had turned up there. A few minutes later, when they stopped in the parking lot of the local hospital, Jonathan jumped out of the car and ran towards the main entrance, where two nurses were taking a cigarette break. Jonathan told these nurses that he was here looking for his wife and that she'd gone on a run 3 hours ago and no one knew where she was now and maybe she's here. So the nurses, who could clearly tell this was an emergency, they put out their cigarettes and went inside to check the register. But a minute later, they came back and told the men that no, Alexia Duvall had not been admitted that morning. She was not here. Before Jonathan or Gregory could protest or ask more questions, the nurses just said, look, you gotta go to the police.
Picture this. You're doing some online shopping, and all of a sudden, you see it. That one product that you've been looking for. You add it to your cart, and as you're filling in your address, you realize you don't have your card anywhere near you. And just when you're about to give up, you see that purple pay button. One tap, and you're checked out in seconds. Shopify's Shop Pay button is used by millions of businesses all around the world, and it's why Shopify has the best converting checkout on the planet. It also helps boost conversions, meaning less carts going abandoned and more sales for you. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the entire United States, from household names like Heinz and Mattel to brands that are just getting started. See less carts go abandoned and more sales with Shopify and their Shop Pay button. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/MrBallen. Go to shopify.com/MrBallen. Again, that is shopify.com/MrBallen.
Later that afternoon, a police officer named Adeline P.O. sat across from Jonathan in a room at the Gray Police Station as he explained what had happened with his wife, that she was missing. Jonathan also gave a description of what Alexia had been wearing when she went out running. Bright pink shoes, black leggings, and a red jacket, so pretty easy to spot. And then after describing her and sort of realizing the weight of what he was here for, he just put his head in his hands and continued to weep, as he had been doing much of the morning. Now, P.O. could obviously tell that Jonathan was very upset here, but she had to ask the question that was already forming in her mind. So, as delicately as possible, she asked Jonathan if his wife had any suicidal tendencies, or any reason she might have run off without telling anybody. Jonathan looked up really quickly and just shook his head and said no, and said that overall his wife was very happy and definitely not suicidal. However, as he sat there thinking about it,
He said she had been taking hormones for fertility, and realistically, those hormones appeared to have affected her really badly. For example, sometimes she would lose control of her emotions entirely and even become violent. Or in other instances, he said that she would even have memory lapses, where she wouldn't even know what she was doing when she was doing it. It was like she'd become this different person. P.O. nodded and just listened to Jonathan and wrote down everything he was saying. And then when he was done, she followed up and said, can you think of anybody who might have had a problem with Alexia? And for a moment, Jonathan just sat there in silence, kind of mulling over the question. And then suddenly his eyes went wide, like he had just realized something. He told P.O. that they had a neighbor who had been completely obsessed with Alexia earlier that year. He said his name was Arnaud, and he'd been obsessively calling and texting her so many times that Alexia had actually had to block his number, and had actually talked about how she was fearful of going out alone because of this neighbor. But just a couple of months earlier, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital, and because he was literally removed from the neighborhood, the harassment had stopped. But Jonathan said they were kind of worried that at some point he would come back and then he would be a problem again. And realistically, Jonathan said he could be home now. I just don't know. I don't know where he is. P.O. was obviously very intrigued by this. And so after this interview was over with Jonathan, she and her investigative team began digging into this Arnaud guy to see where he was and what was going on with him. And pretty quickly, they discovered that while Arnaud had gone to that psychiatric hospital, that was true, he was not there anymore. He had been released. And so that night, another officer with the Grey Police knocked on the door of Arnaud's mother's house, where Arnaud was staying, which was about an hour away from Alexia and Jonathan's house. After the officer knocked, a middle-aged woman answered the door. And when the officer asked if she was Arnaud's mother, she said she was. The officer looked past her, and he could see there was this disheveled-looking young man sitting right inside. And he asked the mother if that was Arnaud. And again, the woman said yes. At this point, the officer asked the mother if he could come inside, because he said he needed to speak privately with her son. The mother and Arnaud in the background both seemed very confused by this, but after a minute, they both agreed, and the officer came inside. And so the officer went inside the house and sat down in the living room with Arnaud, while Arnaud's mother went to the kitchen to give the men some privacy. And then once the mother was gone, the officer looked at Arnaud and just said he had some questions about Alexia Duvall. Arnaud immediately looked down at this question, like he was embarrassed and couldn't even look at the officer. But then he looked back up again and told the officer that he had bipolar disorder, and sometimes when he was in a manic state, he acted inappropriately towards women, including Alexia. The officer followed up about all those messages that apparently Arnaud had sent to Alexia that summer, like what was going on with that. And Arnaud admitted that he had done that, but he insisted it really was no big deal. He said that he and Alexia knew each other because they had been neighbors at one point, and they'd also hung out in a group setting once, and so him being in touch with her was not totally weird, like they had a real connection. But Arnaud clarified that when Alexia told him to stop contacting her, he did, and that was the end of it. But this caught the officer's attention, because according to Alexia's husband, Jonathan, the only reason that all the calls and texts had stopped was because Alexia literally had to block Arnaud's phone number. So the officer just cut to the chase here and told Arnaud that Alexia was missing. And then before Arnaud could say anything, the officer asked him where he'd been that morning at 9 a.m. And Arnaud said, I was right here. I was at home with my mom. For a moment, the officer just stared at Arnaud, trying to read his body language to see if maybe he was being deceptive or not. So eventually, the officer just stood up and went into the kitchen where the mother was. And he asked the mother, "Where was your son this morning?" And she told the officer with sort of a bewildered look on her face that he was here with me all morning. And so at this point, it was clear to the officer that, if the mother was telling the truth here, it would officially rule out Arnaud as a suspect because, he was here. But the officer also knew that, generally speaking, mothers do not make the best alibis because mothers are known to lie, cheat, steal, and do anything to protect their kids. The following afternoon, on Sunday, October 29th, Chief Officer Frank Paredes glanced out his office window as yet another news van sped past outside down the usually quiet streets of Gray. By now, Alexia's disappearance had blown up into this huge national news story, and this was making it really difficult for Paredes, who was in charge of the investigation. Now, it was still early in the investigation, but already he and his investigators were being hounded by reporters and camera crews at every step. Paredes closed his eyes and tried to focus on what his next step should be. The search effort was well underway. They had called in reinforcements from nearby towns and even organized search teams with volunteers from the public. At that very moment, law enforcement was also using drones and dogs to scour the town and the surrounding woods. Paredes' investigation team had also searched Jonathan and Alexia's home by now, secretly hoping they might find something to pin the disappearance on Jonathan. But there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no clues that gave them any direction there. And also, all of Alexia's other family members, her parents, her sister Stephanie, and her brother-in-law Gregory, they could all vouch for each other's whereabouts on the morning of Alexia's disappearance. They claimed they had all been at the house together. And so without any real leads, Paredes had gotten so desperate for any information that he'd literally told his team to set up checkpoints out in the streets and just stop random people and ask them if they had seen or heard anything that could help them find Alexia. And now, as Paredes sat in his office wondering what he was going to do today, he heard a knock at his door. And a moment later, one of his investigators entered with fairly surprising news. The checkpoints actually had turned up something. Paredes listened intently as the investigator explained that a number of people he'd spoken to had mentioned a van. Now, no one had actually seen the van themselves, but they all appeared to have heard the same rumor, that apparently there was a man driving around the area in this white van, and he was known to harass girls and women right out on the street. Now, at first glance, Paredes was worried that perhaps this was just like an unfounded rumor, but then he remembered there were actually two men in Alexia's family who literally drove white vans. Her father, Jean-Pierre, he owned one, and her husband, Jonathan, he drove one for work. On the afternoon of Monday, October 30th, so a little more than 2 days after Alexia went missing, Paredes brought his car to a stop next to a news van parked in the middle of the woods about 4 miles outside of town. Minutes ago, he had received a call from an officer in the field telling him that Alexia's body had been found. And so Paredes had driven out to the scene as fast as he could. But now that Paredes was here at the crime scene, he could tell obviously he was late to the game because, a news crew was already here, setting up their cameras near a row of police barriers. And Paredes was disappointed to see this because he'd hoped that if and when her body was discovered, if she was found dead, at that time he would have had at least one suspect or hopefully multiple suspects identified and under surveillance before the word got out to the general public that Alexia was found dead. But now he obviously would not get that chance. Paredes sighed, climbed out of his car, and flashed his badge to an officer who led him around the barriers and into the crime scene. Paredes approached one of the forensics experts who was taking photos and placing yellow numbered markers around on the ground, and Paredes introduced himself as the lead investigator. The expert then led him over to Alexia's body, which was lying on the ground between two tree trunks covered by a white bedsheet. Her pink running shoes were poking out from under the sheet, and Paredes noticed that her feet and the sheet were both partially burned, as if someone had tried to set them on fire at some point. Once the scene had been fully photographed, Paredes bent down and lifted the sheet to get a better look at Alexia's body. She was lying on her back, and there were bruises all over her face, and there were also marks on her neck that looked like they were from strangulation. And right away, Paredes noticed a couple of things that were unusual. First, Alexia's hands were placed neatly in the pockets of her coat, as though her body had been placed there on the ground with a lot of care. Second, despite the beating that Alexia's face had apparently taken, her glasses were placed perfectly on her face. And so to Paredes, it seemed like whoever killed Alexia had felt some sort of remorse afterwards. It was as though the killer had committed this incredibly violent murder, but then had tried to kind of put everything back in order afterward. And this made Paredes think that Alexia's killer was very likely someone who knew Alexia, and not a stranger who simply, accosted her during a jog. Just then, Paredes heard somebody call his name, and he stood up to take a look. Nearby, there was a forensics tech that was waving him over. And so Paredes walked over, and the tech showed Paredes what he had just found. It was a gray plastic cap that looked like it belonged on some kind of spray can. Paredes thought, maybe this could help explain the strange burn marks on the bedsheet and also Alexia's shoes. The killer had probably sprayed something on the body to try and help it catch fire, but it didn't work as well as they thought it would. Just then, another forensics tech called Paredes over to them to show him something else they had found: tire tracks in the dirt. Paredes immediately thought about that tip that he had been given about this van with this person driving around town harassing women and girls, and he wondered if maybe that was true, that this van was involved and that these had been left by the killer when they were transporting Alexia's body. And so as this forensics expert began taking photographs of the tire tracks, Paredes made a mental note to examine the tires of every suspect, family member, and other persons of interest they came across, just in case one of them was a match. And so Paredes was about to turn his attention back to the body when he noticed one more unusual thing out in the woods. There was this young man who did not appear to be a reporter, just kind of wandering around out there in the trees, almost lurking near the crime scene. And so immediately Paredes went over to this guy and demanded to know what he was doing here. And at this, the man went completely wide-eyed and just started stuttering like he was totally caught off guard. Eventually, the guy managed to mumble that he was just out here picking mushrooms, but Paredes could tell he was obviously lying. That was not why he was out here. And so, operating on sort of a gut instinct, Paredes pulled out his handcuffs and placed the man under arrest. Later that same afternoon, just hours after Alexia's body had been discovered in the woods outside of town, Paredes sat down at a table at the Gray police station across from this suspicious young man he just arrested for lurking near the crime scene for no clear reason. And Paredes was pleased. I mean, he'd only been in charge of what was now a murder investigation for a couple of hours, and here he was about to speak to a legitimate suspect, really like the first suspect, who was in custody. But as soon as Paredes actually began speaking to this suspect, he realized that the young man's stutter was not really a sign of him being nervous. He actually had speech issues, and he struggled to speak at all, even when he wasn't nervous. The man was eventually able to explain that his name was Anthony and he was 29 years old. He said he lived with his parents in Apremont, another small town about 5 miles away, and he admitted that he had lied about being there to pick mushrooms. And so Paredes pressed Anthony to explain then why he was there. And Anthony, he seemed a little embarrassed as he began to explain, but what he said was he didn't know Alexia personally. He had just heard about her disappearance in the news, and he wanted to help with the search effort. But Anthony said he couldn't read or write, so he had not been able to fill out the paperwork to join the official search party. So instead, he'd just driven out to the woods in his own car to look for Alexia himself. But while he was out there, the police showed up and clearly there was something going on. And when Paredes walked over to him, Anthony said he got scared and just lied and said, "Oh, I'm out here picking mushrooms." Like he said it was just embarrassment. And as Paredes sat there listening to the story, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it or really what to make of Anthony. Anthony's demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his behavior was not childlike. It was very adult-like and pretty suspicious. So Paredes followed up by asking him what he was doing on the morning of October 28th, which was the morning Alexia went missing. Anthony said he'd woken up at his parents' house and had breakfast with them before he went out with his girlfriend and also another friend. And he gave Paredes their names and also their phone numbers so they could confirm it. So Paredes stepped out of the room, and he did exactly that. He called the various phone numbers and spoke to the people in Anthony's life, and they all corroborated his alibi. So despite how suspicious Anthony had been acting, Paredes had no choice but to let Anthony go. A week later, on November 5th, a march was organized in Alexia's honor. 10,000 people turned out to show their support for Alexia's family and also to protest violence against women. And hidden among this huge crowd was a pair of police officers who'd been assigned to follow Alexia's husband, Jonathan Duvall. At this point, Jonathan really was looking like the most obvious suspect since he was the husband and also the last person to see Alexia alive. So the police had tapped his phone and put him under surveillance. But all they had learned so far from the phone taps was that Jonathan made frequent calls to Alexia's family, to his own siblings and his friends, to talk about how much he missed his wife. And the officers who were literally following Jonathan around found that he really rarely left his house except to visit Alexia's parents, which he did almost every day. But so far, it was like none of Jonathan's behavior actually seemed really suspicious at all. And now, at this big march, the investigators stood in the crowd and watched as Jonathan hobbled his way up the steps to the podium, followed by Alexia's mother and father. And in fact, Jonathan was trembling so much by the time he got up there that Alexia's parents had to physically prop him up before he could begin reading his speech to the crowd.
And so at this point, the investigators just kind of exchanged a glance. Either they were wasting their time following an obviously grieving husband with nothing to hide, or Jonathan was like a world-class actor giving the performance of a lifetime. But the investigators knew that until new evidence presented itself, there was really nothing they could do but, watch and wait, which included watching Jonathan and just seeing what he did. They were also still waiting on the tire analysis from the crime scene, but they didn't expect much to come from it. At this point, the creepy white van story seemed to be more like an urban legend in this town. And so, as the weeks turned to months and still there was no progress on this case, the investigators, including Paredes, began to wonder if this case would ever be solved. But then, all of a sudden, new evidence did appear. And when it did, the investigators realized they might have been following the wrong lead this whole time. Because while they'd been focused on surveilling Jonathan, a second body had just turned up in the woods outside of Gray. On the evening of Saturday, January 6, 2018, Chief Officer Paredes was at his desk, poring over the evidence that had been flooding in all day. The new victim, whose body had been found earlier that same day in the woods, very close to where Alexia's body had been found, was a 38-year-old father of 3. He looked to have died from a gunshot wound to the head, although, according to the autopsy report, the man had a blood alcohol level of almost 0.4%, which is huge. That can be fatal on its own, or at the very least, knock somebody unconscious. Investigators had found gunpowder on the man's hand, so for now, they were treating his death as a suicide. But the more Paredes looked into the evidence, the less convinced he became that he was looking at a suicide. Because, a gun had been found at the scene, but it had not been located very close to the dead man's body. In fact, the gun was found 130 feet away from the body in a trash can. The only explanation would be he shot himself and then put the gun in the trash can and then somehow wandered 130 feet away before collapsing and dying. That was possible, albeit highly unlikely. Being shot in the head typically is immediately incapacitating or lethal, but it is possible he could have shot himself and lived long enough to travel the 130 feet. It just seemed very unlikely. So now Paredes sat back in his chair and just tried to think. It was strange enough to have 2 violent deaths in this same quiet town, let alone to have the bodies be found basically in the exact same spot in the surrounding woods. It just seemed too coincidental not to be looked into. So he had to wonder, maybe there was a connection between this man's death and Alexia's. But later that same month, as Paredes scanned over a document that had just arrived from the crime lab, he wasn't thinking about that second body in the woods anymore. Because this new document in his hands was an expert analysis of those tire tracks that had been found in the woods near Alexia's body. And the analysis showed that there was a tiny defect in the tread of one of the tires. And this defect was so specific that the experts had been able to determine exactly which vehicle left those tracks in the woods. And this vehicle just so happened to be a white van. Paredes felt his pulse quicken as he kept on reading, and a moment later, he reached for his phone and he called his supervisor to tell him the good news. He knew the identity of Alexia's killer. Based on that tire track analysis and also other evidence, including an eventual confession from the killer, this is how police believe Alexia Duvall was killed. The killer was almost blind with rage. They slammed Alexia's head against a nearby wall and then hit her over and over again. And then they wrapped their hands around her neck and they squeezed for so long they lost track of time. They were just crushing her neck. And then finally, they couldn't feel her pulse under their fingers anymore. Then, looking down at Alexia's motionless body on the ground, they realized the severity of what they had just done. And so the killer, in a panic, crouched down next to her and actually tried to wake her up, but it was too late. She was dead. And so now they're really panicking. They thought about maybe killing themselves out of guilt, but they were too scared to go through with it. So instead, they hatched a plan to get rid of Alexia's body. The killer very carefully put Alexia's glasses back on her face, and then they lifted her up and they carried her body out to their vehicle. Then they drove out to the woods and dragged her body by the feet to a secluded spot deep in the trees where they hoped nobody would ever find her. They covered Alexia's body in a sheet, and then they sprayed the sheet with this foam that they thought was flammable, hoping that once they lit it on fire, it would help, dispose of the body. But when they got their lighter out and held the flame to the sheet, it didn't really work. And so finally, when it was clear they were not going to be able to burn the body here, the killer just left her there and then drove away in their white van, getting home in time to dispose of all the evidence, take a shower, and start the next phase of the cover-up, which was to knock on Alexia's mother's door in a fake panic, asking if anybody had seen her daughter. Because Alexia's killer was her own husband, Jonathan. It turns out Alexia never even went for a run on the morning of October 28th. She was murdered the night before, after she and Jonathan had gotten back from her parents' house. They had gotten into a big fight, which obviously resulted in her death. From the outside, Jonathan and Alexia appeared to be a very happy couple, but in reality, they'd been arguing more and more often, primarily because they were not able to have a baby. It was causing a lot of friction in their marriage. And so on the night of October 27th, in the middle of this horrible fight they're having, Jonathan grabbed his keys and tried to leave, but Alexia told him to stop running away from their problems and tried to literally take the keys from him. And according to Jonathan, that's when he just snapped and he killed her. And then he used his work van to dispose of the body. As for that second body that was found in the woods months later, that was determined to be a suicide and completely unrelated to Alexia's death. Jonathan was arrested on January 28, 2018, and 2 days after his arrest, he confessed to the murder. At the end of his trial in 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.